Chapter 61. Honey Trap. Life in the Soul Society was hard to define. Even though Gojo had only lived here for 5 years, he could already feel his perception of time slowly changing. Perhaps it was because he was already used to living with a perception of time different from other people, so the transition wasn't hard for him. Still, at the end of the day, time passed and each day resembled the previous one. So much so that after a while, you wouldn't know how many days had passed. All that philosophical bullcrap allowed one to reach one simple conclusion. Life in the Soul Society was fucking boring. So, what would happen if more entertainment was developed? Gojo did not know, and honestly, he didn't care either. But since it was necessary, he would give it his all. What's more, imagining the first Shinigami idol groups was quite interesting. After all, no matter which era, there was never a lack of simps that would spend thousands upon thousands for a group of girls that did not even know of their existences. For now though, he had to visit the 13th Division. At Nobleman at 13th Division. Walking alone in the district of the 13th, Gojo had to admit that despite his misgivings about the captain, the order in the division was well maintained. Of course, he understood that this was only possible thanks to the vice captain of the division, Kyan Shiba. Good morning, third seat Gojo. I hope you had a good day. Speaking of the devil, turning to face the speaker, he gave a faint smile and waved his hand. Yo. Kyan was not surprised at Gojo's nonchalant answer, nor was he angered. In the first place, the members of a division only had to respect the superiors in their own division. Outside of it, not even a captain could punish a member of another division without extremely good reasons. Moreover, Kyan liked people with direct personalities. Even though he had to admit that his confident personality was sometimes a problem. Follow me. The captain is resting currently, we will have to wake him up. Nodding, the two began to walk in silence. Even though they had met a few times, they had no common interest and their personalities were completely different. The fact that they did not feel disgust or indifference to each other was mostly thanks to the fact the two of them were people who minded their own business. Walking out of the Seraiti from the west gate, the two of them walked through the Rukongai. This was something that had surprised Gojo when he learned about it. The captain wasn't from a big noble house, but rather from a very small one. So small in fact that the only proof of their nobility was their title. Because of this, they could only live in the Rukongai, albeit the first district. Looking at the back of Kyan, he knew that the Shiba family was also a minor noble family. In the Soul Society, most captains and vice captains were either from the Rukongai or from low-level noble families. In fact, aside from Soi Fan, Byakuya and Shunsui, all the other captains were of low backgrounds. This was something that could never happen in his world. After all, the power of jujutsu techniques was related to the bloodline. While some outliers could appear, they were so incredibly rare that they could be counted on one hand. Of course, Gojo could not dismiss the possibilities that some nobles disdained entering the army. But such reasoning seems flimsy. If the Kuchiki and the Shihoin family could enter the army for generations, then no family was too good for the Gote 13. Rukongai 1st District. Even though they were walking, it didn't take them long to reach their destination. Let's wait here, please. Sitting under the shade of a tree, the captain, Jishiro Yukitaki, could be seen gently reading a story while some kids of the Rukongai listened to him, their eyes full of sparkles. It was well known that Jishiro loved children. Be it because of his nature or because he had 4 little brothers, either way, it was rather admirable. Even though Gojo did not really like the man, he had to give him respect where it was due. Though, the concept of children in the Soul Society was pretty complicated. After all, since those children were from the Rukongai, there were high chances of them being tens of years old. This was something Gojo was still slowly coming to grips with. Thankfully, it didn't take long for the story to end, and Jishiro invited the two of them to his home. Seraiti, 12th Division. While Gojo was discussing with Jishiro, in the 12th Division, a man whose face was painted in black and white, giving him the appearance of a skeleton, and wearing a white cloak over his Shinigami uniform could be seen furiously typing while facing strings of data. On the back of his cloak, the number 12 could be seen. He was Mayuri Kuretsuchi, current captain of the 12th Division and an ex-criminal. This is impossible. No, how is it possible? Mayuri was a scientist. As a scientist, he knew that nothing was impossible in this world. On the screen, a picture of a silver-haired man fighting a group of Jillian could be seen. What was infuriating was that from time to time, even though he was fighting, the man would pause while facing the cameras that should have been hidden. Clearly, he knew that he was being observed. His shikai makes no sense. He growled with frustration. Even after years of study, he still did not even have the start of an hypothesis. No matter how Mayuri tried to explain it, he could only feel stumped. Shinigami were unable to control reishi. Even their ability to walk on reishi footholds was only possible on Earth, where the concentration of reishi was incredibly low, allowing it to be pulled towards them. Since Shinigami could not do so, then their Zanpakuto should not be able to either. But this man, I need to experiment on him. Hitting his keyboard with frustration, Mayuri couldn't help but curse. He hated this feeling of not understanding something. At the same time, he felt his will burning more than he could ever imagine. To this day, he had experimented on hundreds of Quincy souls. It could be said that no one knew Quincy's more than himself. But even then, he had never been able to replicate their power. Nemu. Yes. A slender, but well-endowed black-haired woman walked out of the shadow. Her clothes were basically the same as the normal Shinigami's uniform, but the large pants were replaced by a short skirt that barely reached her knees. She also wore a pair of white gloves on her hands and a red choker around her neck. All this while, she had been standing in the corner in silence while observing her captain and creator, her face betraying absolutely no emotions. She was Nimari Kuretsuchi, the vice captain of the 12th Division. If there was one eye-catching thing about her, aside from her rather revealing clothes, it would be that despite being a Shinigami and a vice captain at that, she had no sword on her hips. Looking at his masterpiece, Mayuri advanced toward her then began to walk all around while observing her with a sharp look. Sometimes he would nod his head while other times he would shake it. As I thought, I have taken into account the appearance department when I created you. Now it will finally be useful. Inhaling deeply, Mayuri finally took his decision. Nemu. I am listening. I want you to seduce Satoru Gojo. Quote. Yes. For the first time in a long while, Nemu showed an expression other than indifference or melancholy on her face. She was quite perplexed. Chapter 62. Jashiro Yukitaki. After Gojo gave a bottle of medication to Jashiro, he invited them to drink some tea. The accommodations in the house were rather simplistic. So much that it was inconceivable that a captain lived in such a condition. The first time he came here, he had been clearly surprised, but Kaien then explained to him the reasons. It seemed that most of the salary of the captain was used to ameliorate the living condition of those living in the Rukongai. Souls with negligible amounts of Raryoku did not need food to survive. But, the problem was that even though most souls could not reach the level necessary to enter the academy and become Shinigami, they had some modicum of energy, at least enough to develop the need for sustenance. To such souls, their powers were nothing more than a curse. Jashiro tried to develop different ways to help the poor. Of course, no matter how high his pay was, he was just one captain. The amount of help he could bring was negligible. But this never stopped him. It was truly admirable, even though Gojo would never sacrifice himself for a bunch of people he had no relation with. At the same time, it was extremely laughable. The fact that the well-being of the population was not assured by the ruling power but rather the members of the army showed to Gojo how most nobles acted. People like Soifan and Byakuya were without a doubt the exception to the rules. Those two did not look down on the poor, they simply looked down on the weak. Looking at the distance, Jashiro began to speak. Nowadays, the number of Shinigami is constantly lowering. I do not know why, but since about 100 years ago, cases of Shinigami mysteriously vanishing or being killed while fighting variant hollows have been constantly on the rise. Why is he bringing this up? Satoru-san, 5 years ago, during your outing on Earth while in the academy, you faced a group of variant hollows. What is your opinion about that matter now that you have seen other types of hollows? Gojo thought back to the past event. Well, even though I thought of them as rather weak back then, now I can honestly say they were above average. In terms of pure power, they were incredibly close to Jillian's. Jillian's was the first step of the evolution of Manos. They were created from the amalgamation of thousands of hollows. For one hollow to come close to that level, it is as I thought. Sighing, he continued, I plan to make a proposal to Central 46 soon. Oh, did you know, on Earth, there are more and more high-spec humans appearing. People able to see and even exorcise Fuyurei 1, Jibakure 2, or Sukire 3. The same goes for the number of Fullbringers who are able to face hollows, albeit with difficulty. Fuyurei were a type of spirit that had no particular attachment to the living world, they were just waiting to slowly dissipate and join the Soul Society, or be lucky enough to meet a Shinigami that would accelerate the process. Of course, the unlucky ones were transformed into hollows or were eaten by hollows. Jibakure and Sukire on the other hand were ghosts full of attachment bound to either a place or a person. Because of this, they were easier targets for hollows since they couldn't move around. This topic interested Gojo. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen if some humans learned his cursed techniques. Even though he still wasn't able to recreate Limitless nor any of the secret techniques of the other great clans, he was slowly creating his own style of combat that was outside of the conventional Kido. Jashiro, unaware of Gojo's thoughts, continued. As such, I wondered, what if we used the help of those humans? But most humans, who are able to use Raryoku are unable to make proper rituals. Their powers are too destructive against souls. Jashiro nodded excitedly. This is why I was wondering if we could lend our power to humans. We could easily triple or quadruple our numbers. They would not even need to fight hollows. Just giving them the means to send spirits to the Soul Society would help greatly. Gojo tilted his head. This is good and all, but isn't it against the law? Pretty sure the punishment was execution. Gojo knew personally how much the higher-ups liked to give execution orders. This was why one of the first things he memorized was the set laws of the Soul Society. Though calling them laws was a stretch. It basically boiled down to, don't fuck around and don't go against us. Otherwise, you will be imprisoned or executed. That is indeed the case. Jashiro grimaced, but the fighting spirit in his eyes did not diminish. Even so, I will still make the proposal. We could begin with some samples. A trial run with 1 or 2 humans. I even already decided on a name for the system. Clearing his throat, he said with pride, they will be called Substitute Shinigami. What do you think? Kyan shrugged, a little too direct, but it isn't a bad name. Gojo wanted to say that it sucked ball, but seeing the joy on Jashiro's face, he sighed. Your naming sense is so abominably bad it's impressive. How could he use vulgar words in front of a captain? Snicker. Kyan hid a laugh, while Jashiro looked dumbfounded before he exploded with laughter. You really got me good. Cough cough. Jashiro was someone who could take a joke. Though seeing him cough sometimes was disturbing. Gojo even wondered if the man was born with a heavenly restriction. Though he doubted that this system existed in this world. After this, the three of them continued to joke around when a black-haired woman appeared next to them with Shunpo. Captain, I am here to report. Gojo recognized her as the wife of Kyan and third seat of the 13th Division. Oh, Miyako, what's the matter? My team reported the activities of an unknown type of hollow in the vicinity of our territory. We believe that it should be a variant type. I have decided to form a recon team to obtain more information on the target. Both Kyan and Jashiro frowned. This could be very dangerous. Do not worry. We will be careful to not engage the target even if we find it. Kyan gritted his teeth, but ultimately did not try to stop his wife. She had her own pride and he knew that he would undermine her authority if he always followed her around. It was then, what would you think if a very good and very handsome healer came with you? It has been some time since he last observed a variant. This could be interesting. Chapter 63. Nemu 1. After Gojo proposed to join the team, they had decided to meet tomorrow during the night. Since they knew that Gojo was someone who should be equal to a captain in terms of power, they had decided to use the occasion to bring some recruits into the teams in order to help them broaden their experience. After all, variants were becoming a problem that needed to be dealt with. Normally, divisions did not interact with each other when it came to simple missions, only in times of wars would the whole Gote 13 work together. The only exceptions in normal times were the healing departments and secret forces when the problem was in the Soul Society. At Nobleman at. Meanwhile, if the problem was on Earth, the Kido Corps would appear to open a Senkaimon with the right coordinate or send a message with the Hell Butterflies. Meanwhile, the scientific department would freeze the space in the given zone, or outright create an alternate space. The longer he lived here, the more surprised Gojo was at the Soul Society. One moment they would show technologies that didn't even appear in his time, then the next they would show backward rules or systems. During his fight with the Jillians, he had been surprised to see that he was being observed by what looked like hidden cameras. Of course, he also believed that they were unable to capture how magnificent he was, and as such struck some interesting poses. What was that girl called? Nemu, was it? Gojo wasn't just interested in her because she was a beautiful and voluptuous woman. What really interested him was none other than her constitution. No matter how he looked at her, he had the impression that he was facing a doll. It didn't help that her body seemed defective and her soul broken. Gojo had only seen such a thing a few times when doing a mission on Earth. An artificial or a modified soul and an artificial body. In the Soul Society, when Shinigami's went on Earth for extended missions, they were given a Gigai or artificial body and Gikan or artificial soul. The difference between an artificial and a modified soul was pretty subtle. Gikans could be compared to simple AI installed in the fake body with preset commands. They had no personalities and could not act outside of the commands given. Modified souls, meanwhile, were of superior level, since they had their own thoughts and their own personalities. It was even possible for them to possess a normal human body and live a normal life, grow, fall in love and die. In a way, they were no different from normal souls. It was because of this that the project had been cancelled by the order of the Central 46. For ethical reasons. Ethical my ass. Gojo would rather die once again than believe that there was anything ethical about those bastards. Most likely, they were just frightened by the potential of mod souls and decided to protect their asses. Murmuring like that, he finally reached his quarter. Over the years, since he had jumped in grade, the house he lived in had greatly changed. Entering his home and taking a look at the wide but spacious living room. Man, the house is so big now. I might need a maid. As soon as he finished, a shadow seemed to jump toward him, while a knife, bathed in a purple liquid, streaked toward his throat. Even though the situation seemed so dangerous, a smile formed on Gojo's face. Just when I needed a maid. Everything happened in a flash. Before the assailant could even understand what happened, all the shadows in the room stretched before swallowing her. In an instant, all traces of a possible attack vanished. Gojo took off his blindfold while sighing. The skills of those Quincy's are so useful. I really wonder how they lost. From what he has heard, the golden age of the Gote 13 had been during its creation. All the first-generation captains were criminals who were not far from Unohana level. This was one of the reasons why Quincy lost the first war against the Shinigami despite all the advantages they had in a world filled with reishi like the Soul Society. The skill he had just used was called Shadow. A skill only a select few Quincy were able to use, even during the war 900 years ago. Well, then, let's see what that girl from the 12th Division wanted with me. Despite her disguise, for Gojo who did not care about the external appearance of those around him, how could he confuse her for anyone? Though, it was surprising for the 12th Division to try to murder him. Well, it seems like some torture is in order. Giving a faint smile, the shadows under his feet grew before slowly swallowing him. If anyone had been present while knowing about Gojo's Shikai, they would have been surprised. By one detail. In the Soul Society, it was impossible for a Shinigami to use the power of their Shikai without calling the name and reciting the incantation. There was only one exception: that person had to have reached the Bankai. Chapter 64. Nemu 2. Soul Society. Unknown location. So, let me get this straight. In a cavern, Gojo sat facing a beautiful black-haired woman who was bound in the air by chains of reishi. This cavern was a sort of safe house he had created over the years. After all, a smart rabbit always had 3 burrows. As for the woman dangling in the air, Gojo easily recognized her. Nemu Kuretsuchi, vice captain of the 12th Division. The fact that her panties showed a little from her mini kimono and that the way the chains bound her weirdly looked like BDSM as it crawled around her breasts was nothing more than a coincidence. Gojo was a gentleman after all. You weren't trying to kill me. Your captain ordered you to seduce me. But since you had no knowledge in this kind of matter, you decided that the best way was to knock me out with the poison on that dagger and drag me in my room. Have the deed done, then make me take responsibility. Am I right? Yes. Gojo couldn't help but facepalm. What the hell? Honestly, he had been ready to kill the intruder after torturing her to know who was the culprit. When it came to matters of life and death, Gojo knew he was no gentleman. Underestimating women was a ticket to sure death. After all, even in his world, one of the 4 special grade sorcerers was a woman. There were also women like Maki, who after the death of her sister, Mai, was able to manifest the full might of her heavenly restriction and massacred the entire Zenin family. Meanwhile, in this world, you had women like Unohana who could make grown men piss themselves in fright just by releasing her bloodlust. So, no, Gojo never looked down on women. This was also why he had used his shadow without reservation. After all, the dead tell no tales. From the perspective of the Soul Society and what he has shown, he could only use basic skills of Quincy. Skills such as absorbing reishi to create weapons and so on. They did not know that he was able to do much more. One of the reasons he did that was of course to not make the Central 46 wary of him. But there was also another and far more important reason. Space-time Keto were forbidden in the Soul Society. Of course, once again, the punishment for the transgression was death. For once, Gojo really understood why they had to set such a law. He knew for example that his shadow skill could even potentially allow him to travel to and from the Hueco Mundo, at a nobleman at. For example, he could bring an entire army of hollows into the Soul Society if he was willing to. Or he could enter the deepest level of Mukan and free the prisoners. In short, there were many ways for him to fuck up the Soul Society with space manipulation. This was why it was forbidden. Of course, it was possible to argue that this was his Zanpakuto skill and not just a Keto spell. So, in theory, he had not broken the law. But he was pretty sure that this wouldn't matter to the higher-ups. Gojo knew that there were some gadgets that could help erase the memory of people in this world. But such gadgets only worked on humans. This means that he only had two ways. Should I just kill her? His eyes became cold as he looked at her. He had no particular qualms about killing her. Though it would be a shame to kill such a beautiful woman, it wouldn't disturb him at all. But, killing her just because of the chance of his secret being leaked. How could he fall so low? He was in no way afraid of his secret being leaked, he just didn't want to deal with troubles. A smile formed on his face. So what if they find out? At most, I will just leave. There was literally nowhere he couldn't go. In fact, if he had to be honest, all he lacked was an excuse to leave. He did not have much to learn from the Soul Society after all. Though it would be a shame to lose his friends and the occasion to read at the library. You are lucky. I am in a good mood today. You are not going to kill me. Gojo, who was about to activate his shadow and send her away, stopped. He looked at her face once more. He saw no relief at the notion of being left alive, and though she did show fear when he briefly released his killing intent, now that he thought about it, this didn't seem like she really feared death itself. You do not seem happy. Why is that? Gojo asked curiously. He had honestly always viewed her as a kind of robot or android, but it seemed that he had to reconsider. Quote. I have failed. I guess Mayuri-sama will be disappointed. Regret flashed on her face. An emotion even stronger than the fear of death she had previously shown. So for you, disappointing that crazy bastard is worse than dying. She seemed to hesitate as if she could not find the words to explain herself. I do not know. It's just that, when I thought of disappointing Mayuri-sama, I felt sad. Did he put some mind control in her during her creation? Or is it a form of Stockholm Syndrome? From what he knew, Nemu was not particularly well treated by her captain. He did not know to what extent it went, but he was pretty sure that it went beyond verbal abuse. After all, her body is a mess. He wasn't talking about something like wounds or proof of beatings. It was something much worse. Something he could not explain. Drugs, poisons, and a bunch of unknown things. I do not know how he stored them in you. But you are basically a walking biochemical weapon. Nemu flinched before simply falling silent. Sighing, Gojo scratched his head, and slowly lowered her down before taking away the chain binding her. Man, I really have a thing for lost kittens. Pictures of Megumi flashed in his mind when he looked at her. It was hard to say who had the shittiest father between the two. Walking in her direction, he stopped just a few centimeters away from her and peered down at her. One of the advantages of being tall was that you could basically look down on everyone. Bring me to the 12th division. I need to have a little discussion with your father. Nemu took a step back, and asked with suspicion on her face. Are you going to fight? Fight? Oh, no. God preserve us. I promise you that there will be no fight. Gojo wasn't lying. After all, how could a one-sided beatdown be called a fight? Chapter 65. Mayuri Kuretsuchi, 1. Seraiti, 12th Division Territory. Running alongside Gojo, Nemu couldn't help but take a look at his side profile. Even though she wasn't particularly well acquainted with emotions and had a rather low EQ, she could still understand that he was angry on her behalf. All her life, the few people she had interacted with had always been angry at her, not for her. After all, at the end of the day, she was nothing more than a doll, a weapon created for no particular purpose. She could not even be said to be unique. The 7th Nimari. That was her number. 6 came before her. She did not know what happened to them, but they were most likely deemed as failures and erased. Of course, if there was a 7th, nothing stopped an 8th, a 9th, or even a 100th to come. A worthless, disposable tool. That was how she could most accurately describe herself. Back when Gojo had captured her and used his space Kido, she had already determined that she had no chances of survival. She did not struggle because she had already determined that her chance of escaping was zero. Only she felt a little reluctant. Living a worthless life and dying a worthless death. But she had been surprised, she had been spared. Why was it? She did not understand. She could not understand. But she wished to understand. She needed to understand. Why did you spare me? She asked after they stopped using Shunpo for a short while. He seemed surprised by her question. You are still stuck on that. I do not understand. Your decision is irrational. If I give your secret away, you will be branded as a criminal. Heian, it isn't like being a criminal is such a big deal. Looking at his side profile while he chuckled and uttered such words, she finally understood. He was free, be it in the way he acted or the way he thought. He was completely different from her. For the first time in her life, Nemu felt her heart speed up and beat far faster than it should have. At the same time, she could feel her cheeks grow warmer. She did not understand the fuzzy and warm feelings that were sprouting inside of her. All she knew was that she yearned for more of it. Once they reached the main building, Gojo remarked that most if not all people were absent. Aside from some guards, there were basically no Shinigami. What's happening? Our division is the one with the fewest members in the Gote 13. Also, most of them are scientists, so they spend their time in the underground base. Then lead the way. A few minutes later. I know I am the one who brought you here and told you to lead the way, but is this really okay? Gojo scratched his head as he asked with an awkward expression. From the moment they took steps into the facility, they had to pass tens of different checkpoints. Each with its own security system. It was honestly freaky how much the guy they were going to visit seemed to care about his own security. At this point, Gojo knew that if he had come alone, even though the infiltration would still succeed, it would clearly not be as easy. After all, he couldn't really just blow up everything and enter. Well, he could, but it would have been a pain. Still, it was honestly pretty weird. After all, she was supposed to be kidnapped. He couldn't understand why she was so compliant. Is she tricking me? Is it a trap? The possibility of it being the case was pretty high. But Gojo just shrugged. Worrying about things without taking action was a waste of time. Finally, they reached a large door seemingly made out of metal. We have arrived. Man, this feels so underwhelming. He had been prepared for explosions, drama, revelations and so many things. But, just like this, he reached the boss room. What about the grinding? What about the hordes of mobs that served absolutely no purpose aside from stalling for time? He sighed, and knocked on the door. Hello, I know you have been observing us from the start. Open the door pretty please. Nemu opened her eyes wide at the brazen display. She had thought that he would try to sneak up all the way until the end, so this really came as a shock to her. Satoru Gojo. You are really a special specimen. The voice of a man filled the white hallway. Man, has anyone told you that your voice is creepy? Now then, open the door before I blast it. Snort you can try. This door has been created with a special alloy that less than black flash. Blood artery greater than. Boom. The voice of Mayuri, previously full of derision, stopped at the unbelievable sight. The door had been specially created to take on even Hado in the 70s without any scratch. But that man managed to completely distort the door with just one hit. Gojo also seemed surprised. Oh, this door is surprisingly tough. I was pretty sure that I would have taken it down in one hit. Black and red lightning surrounded his body, while blue energy-like veins appeared on his arm. Over the 5 years, Hana did not simply train his skills in Zanjutsu. She had dedicated herself to train his physical skills to the utmost possible. The result was this skill. In the beginning, it put a strain so high on his body he felt like he would explode. Now though, he could use it for an extended amount of time without much problem. Well, if one isn't enough, I guess a second one will do. Clenching his fist, he was about to bring it down a second time when Piesh. The sound of the door as it tried to open, sounded in its ears. Sadly, because of the damage it just received, it did not manage to open fully. See, if only you had opened the door sooner, we could have avoided all this unpleasantness. Sigh. Such a shame. Using the gap, he entered the boss room. Nimari, who was as shocked as Mayuri, tried to follow, but a hand stopped her. TCH. You stay here. It won't be long, I assure you. Giving her a smile, He raised his hand and interlocked his middle and index fingers before murmuring. Curtain. Immediately, the scene in the interior of the room vanished after an opaque barrier appeared in front of her. Placing her hand uneasily on the barrier, she couldn't help but wonder what those two were about to talk about. What she could not guess was that what was about to happen behind the curtains would be the first step toward an event that would shake the foundation of the Seraiti. Chapter 66. Mayuri Kuretsuchi, 2. Once he activated the curtain, Gojo shrugged, turned around, and began to look at the laboratory. Whistle. Pretty badass. Really fits the whole mad scientist thing. The atmosphere and equipment present in the room seemed so high-tech that Gojo felt like he was in the future. Once again he had to give his respect to the weird sense of technology those Shinigamis had. Satoru Gojo. How long do you plan to ignore me? Mayuri, who stood with his back to a bunch of large screens that had become black, growled while holding his sword. He could feel that all the connections he had with the exterior of this room had been severed. Hung well, you are just so ugly. I fear that I will have nightmares if I look at your face too much. I have a fragile heart, you know. Bastard. Still, I guess you aren't a captain for nothing. Even your acting is top-notch. How strong is the poison you have been filling this room with? Mayuri's eyes widened, before all the fear and anger on his face vanished. Placing his finger on his temple, he murmured. So your eyes really allow you to observe both Reishi and Raryoku at the level of particles. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. What's more, you seem to not be affected by my poison despite breathing enough to kill many Shinigamis. How intriguing. The change of demeanor would have surprised anyone else, but not Gojo. All the captains had different personalities. But Gojo knew one thing. None of them were cowards. Shaking his head, he ignored the mumbling Mayuri and took a seat on a stool. Hey, Mayuri, I have a deal for you. Mayuri did not seem bothered by the lack of respect in Gojo's voice. Even though he wasn't really a warrior, he still recognized Gojo as someone equal to him. What do you want? Work for me. Quote. What? Mayuri Kuretsuchi, former prisoner in the maggot's nest. The only prisoner who was placed in a separate cell, because you were judged as too dangerous. The maggot's nest in the 2nd division was, in a way, a jail, and at the same time, it wasn't. The reason for this was simple. A jail was a place for criminals. But people imprisoned in the maggot's nest were not criminals. They were potential criminals. People whose personalities were judged problematic by the Central 46 and could potentially hurt the interests of the Seraiti. Since Gojo had been working with the secret force from time to time, he had managed to glean some secrets here and there while training his seduction techniques against some kunoichis of the secret forces. Learning about the maggot's nest had been a surprise. This prison was simply sickening. When I learned about the maggot's nest, do you know what I thought? Quote. I thought, in the end, be it heaven or the mortal world, there is no difference. Higher ups are always trash. Those words were said with complete indifference, but Mayuri, who had seen many things in his life, could detect the deep killing intent in his words. It seems like he had some altercations with people in high positions when he was alive. So you find it unjust? Do you want to save them? Gojo put his little finger in his right ear and chuckled. I am no ally of justice. Why should I care about people who have nothing to do with me? He isn't lying. The more Mayuri looked at the man, the more interesting he found him. Initially, he was about to flat out reject the proposal, but now, he wanted to listen a little and study his psychological state. See, in the Seraiti, we have potential criminals in jail, meanwhile, we have actual criminals, acting as captains. One of them is even the commandant. Isn't it funny? Gojo laughed while saying so. Those powerful enough can be used. No matter how dangerous they are. Bingo. So much contradiction. Just shows how helpless and hypocritical the members of the Central 46 are. Suppress people who are dangerous but weak. Shackle people who are dangerous but too strong. At the end of the day, all their beautiful talks about justice and protecting the balance are nothing more than beautiful bullshit they spout to cover their own cowardice. So you will betray the Soul Society. Gojo waved his fingers, tch. Firstly, really, hidden camera and tape recordings. Stop underestimating me, okay. Secondly, who is talking about betrayal? As long as they don't fuck with me, I am willing to play the good soldier. But the moment they try something shady, hee. The rest of the sentence did not need to be said. Will you kill me if I refuse? Nah, you make me seem like I am the bad guy. I have my ways to make sure you never reveal anything. Only, it might cripple you permanently and change you into a retard. Mayuri's eyes flashed. You used that technique on Akaku Madarame 5 years ago. This time it was Gojo's turn to be surprised. I have records about Madarame staying in the 4th division after his fight against you. He suffered from a headache and short memory loss for about a week. I guess you can make this permanent. You were pretty well informed. I see. Giving his back. 60 years ago, a man made the same proposal to me. Quote. Kazuki Urahara, was it? Indeed. He asked me to work for him and he promised that should anything happen to him, I would take control of everything he had built. This is why I have left the maggot's nest with him. What about you? What can you give me? Gojo smiled. What if I told you that I could help you realize your greatest dream? My dream. Mayuri seemed to be stunned before he began to laugh loudly. It was as if he had heard the funniest joke. Once he stopped, he spoke while shaking his head. I have humored you because I thought you had something interesting to say, but I am quite disappointed. I guess I shouldn't have expected much from the beginning. Now then, the creation of a natural body. Quote. What did you say? Hey, seems like I got your interest now, didn't I? Mayuri ignored the sarcasm in Gojo's words as his mind began to churn at lightning speed. Is he lying? Is he telling the truth? If he is telling the truth, how could I use him? Should I try to kill him now? Activate my Bankai to call for help and capture him. He kept thinking and thinking about the pros and cons of the situation from all possible sides. No matter how he looked at it, this was something disadvantageous to him. But, I want to know. It was like a blazing fire was being lit in his chest. Like a scratch on the back that could not be reached. Watching him like this, Gojo smirked. Mayuri Kutsushi was a man without any sort of morals, whose sole objective was knowledge. In order to obtain the knowledge, this man would stop at nothing. When a Shinigami killed a hollow, they, in reality, purified it and allowed it to enter the cycle, thereby maintaining equilibrium. 1. Even when a hollow eats a soul, that soul would become part of its very being or transformed into another hollow. Once again maintaining the cycle. But Quincy's are different. When a Quincy kills a hollow, that hollow is well and truly exterminated. At the same time, hollows were poison for Quincy and a Quincy killed by a hollow would have his soul destroyed with no chance of reincarnation. One could even say that the two races were natural enemies. This wasn't all. After the war against the Quincy's, the man experimented on Quincy's souls in thousands of different ways, each more gruesome than the other. In fact, most of the information Gojo had on Quincy's came from Mayuri's research. People who would think that this man was crazy were extremely wrong. Mayuri wasn't crazy. He was an overly rational man who saw the world and all living beings as test subjects, even himself. That was why Gojo wanted him. In order to learn Limitless, he had to enter the Dongai, which was under the supervision of the 12th Division. In order to understand his Shikai skills better, he needed someone who understood Quincy's extremely well. This wasn't all. The 12th Division had access to many types of technologies. Some of them could even allow something as crazy as space freezing. Having this man under his control would be incredibly useful. But, I refuse. I knew you would say that. Gojo smiled and stood up. Mayuri narrowed his eyes while tightening his grip on the sword. He was ready to blow up the entire building to smithereens, then activate his Bankai. But, rather than walking toward him, Gojo walked away. You are not going to silence me or force me. Ha ha ha. How could I kill my future scientist? I refused. Do not worry. I know you will change your mind once you think about it. Saying so, he swiped his right hand and broke the barrier he had erected. Initially I wanted to beat you up, but this would have to wait for later. Now though, I am taking Nemu with me. Are you threatening me? A threat? Gojo stopped. All it took was a snap. By the time Mayuri even understood what was happening, he could feel an arm coil around his shoulder. Mayuri, my dear friend, I don't need to threaten you. Patting his back, Gojo laughed. If I wished to kill you, nothing, absolutely nothing could stop me from doing so. If your loyalty to the Soul Society is so high, then you are free to sell me out if you wish. But, murmuring in his ears, he continued, we know very well that you won't, right? How could you sacrifice your life for something as flimsy as loyalty? Gojo's laugh as he vanished from the room was the last thing he heard. Now alone, he did not even try to verify if Nemu was still present in the hallway. He knew it was futile. Clenching his fists, his eyes bloodshot, Mayuri murmured the name of Gojo hoarsely. Gojo Satoru. Today was the most humiliating day in his life. At the same time, the cold part of his mind kept repeating the words Gojo uttered. The creation of a true natural body. Something that he was simply unable to accomplish no matter what. Dash dash dash. Back in his cavern, Gojo couldn't help but laugh while rolling in the air. Watching him like this, while doing her best to ignore the fact that Gojo was floating using reishi, something that should be impossible in the Soul Society, she couldn't help but ask. What makes you so happy? Wiping a tear from the corner of his eyes, Gojo stopped laughing. Nothing much. I just discovered that playing the evil boss was quite entertaining. Waving his hand, he continued with a serious expression. Now then, let's talk about an important thing, shall we? It's something I have always wondered about. Nemu could not help but straighten her back. She understood very well that she was now being kidnapped. She couldn't help but wonder what her future would be like. From the serious expression on his face, it seemed that it would be a really important problem. That's why, when he finally spoke, tell me, why do you fight in a skirt that barely covers your butt? Do you have an exhibitionism fetish? Nemu could only stare speechlessly. Chapter 67. Gathering. 4th Division. Main Office. The next morning. And this is what happened. So, not only did you join the mission of another squad without my permission, you also kidnapped the vice captain of the 12th Division after she tried to assault you. When you say it like this, it seems so bad. In the first place, why would she try to assault you? Because I am handsome. Quote. Teehee. Teehee. My ass. SATORU. How many times do I have to tell you? When you want to wreak havoc, you are free to do so, but it shouldn't be tracked back to you. This way, even if everyone knows it's you, without proof, they can do nothing. Ha ha ha. Stop frowning. You are ruining your beautiful skin. Hana dismissed his compliment with a wave of her hand. Forget it. Anyway, you aren't a kid, you deal with your own problems. I have only one question. Are you sure she won't rat you out? Hana's eye flashed ominously. She had invested too much in this student of hers to simply let him get ruined because of a woman. If necessary, she could kill her in a way so thorough, people would think she was eaten by a hollow or something of the like. She was used to changing crime scenes. After all, during her time as a criminal, she would need such skills to not let her abilities be recognized when she was chased by bounty hunters. You could say that she was a master in treating dead bodies. Though, generally, when she got bored of running away, she would simply stop hiding her tracks and massacre them all. Watching their expression of shock was always funny in her mind. Ignoring the rather dark and bloody thoughts of his captain, Gojo simply shrugged. I am simply keeping her with me because the structure of her body interests me. Even if I release her and she rats out my space technique, it doesn't really matter, does it? I will just leave if necessary. Hana simply nodded, not shocked at his words. She was the closest one to him and knew basically all the secrets about his Zanpakuto. Gojo trusted her quite a bit. After all, she did not really share the Soul Society's sense of justice. Back then, when he asked her why she joined the Soul Society and protected the world, her answer was pretty simple. In this world, only the strong can destroy or protect the balance. Hence, the best way to face strong people is either to try breaking the balance or protecting it. But destroying it would only lead to the elimination of all the potentially strong people rising in the future, thus I merely decided to protect it. Back then, Gojo could only raise a thumbs up at this convoluted way of thinking that was so much like her. That's why Gojo knew. Whether he stayed or betrayed the Soul Society, it didn't really matter to her. If he stayed, she would nurture him to surpass her, and if he left, she would face him as an enemy and either die or kill him. It was so straightforward, it was refreshing. At nobleman at. Anyways, standing up, he stretched a little and walked away. I have a job to do, can't afford to be late. Hana could only helplessly shake her head at his nonchalant attitude. Take care. Even though she said so, she was not really worried. It was impossible for a hollow powerful enough to threaten Gojo to enter the Soul Society without being caught. Rukongai, 60th West District. The Rukongai was divided into 4 great zones: West, East, North, and South. Each zone was composed of 80 districts. The higher the number of the district, the farther it was from the Seraiti and the more lawless it was. It was to the level where mass murder and the like were incredibly common around the confines of the 80th district. Because of this, weak hollows that managed to enter the Soul Society undetected could kill a great number of souls before anyone found out that something fishy was happening. Following behind the 3rd seat of her division, Rukia could not help but feel complicated as she watched the situation. After all, she was also from the furthest zone of the Rukongai, the 79th district of the South Zone. For about 100 years, she, Renji, and a few of their friends stayed there and survived as much as they could. In the end, only the two of them survived and decided to enroll in the academy. Stressed. Raising her head, she looked at the worried expression on Miyako's face and shook her head. I am sorry, third seat Miyako. This will not happen again. Miyako gave her a reassuring smile and did not comment further. Even though the two of them were close, this was currently an official mission and as such, the hierarchy had to be respected. Though because Miyako and Kaien had the same family name, they directly addressed her with her given name. Initially, Rukia should not have participated in this mission. After all, even though she had awakened her Shikai, in terms of experience, she was still a newbie. Most did not understand why, but Miyako knew that it was because of the Kuchiki family. Not only did they stop Rukia from participating in any dangerous missions, but they even stopped any attempts of advancement. This was why, even though Rukia had the skill equal to a single-digit seated officer, she still had no official seat. The same would have happened for this mission, but after it was made known that SATORU Gojo would follow, the Kuchiki family made no fuss. It seemed that despite their rivalry, Byakuya Kuchiki trusted the skills of SATORU Gojo. Well, I will admit that I was also more relaxed after knowing he would join. The fame of Gojo was unprecedented. If only the rumors about his womanizing ways and the fact that he was a troublemaker were not taken into account, he was pretty much the perfect soldier. Aloha, everyone. What a good day, don't you think? Miyako shuddered at the sudden voice sounding from behind her. She had to fight all her instincts to not just turn around and slash with her sword. I did not even feel him. If he had wished, he could have killed them all before they even understood what was happening. Thankfully, the Soul Society was full of people that could kill her with a snap of their fingers, so she was used to it. Bowing to Gojo, she said, "Good morning, third seat SATORU Gojo. Now that you are here, I can once again summarize the mission." Even though the two of them had the same rank, Miyako was still extremely polite. But despite her polite attitude, Gojo did not miss the soft rebuke in her words. Ha ha ha. Sorry for being late. I was a little, let's say busy. I understand. Now then. Facing the other members of her squad, Miyako spoke. This is nothing more than a scouting mission. The number of civilians who vanished in this zone is abnormally high. The cause is an unknown type of hollow. As such, we must be careful. We will move in teams of 3 and spread out. If anyone meets the target, then prioritize escaping. If you cannot escape, activate the flare. Fight and gather as much information as possible before sending them with your Hell Butterfly. Miyako gave those orders with a cold voice. This was the Soul Society. Death was so common that most were desensitized to it. Yes. No Shinigami flinched at her declaration. Information was precious. Using the life of 1 or 2 Shinigami to save 100 more was definitely worth it in their opinions. Even if this sacrifice had to be their own selves. Chapter 68. A new project. Saraiti, 5th Division. Captain, the 13th Division finally caught traces of your hollow. I know. The experiment had been rather disappointing until now, so I wanted to see how it would do against Shinigami, but there is a variable. Indeed. Sighing, Aizen adjusted his glasses as he thought about the unexpected variable. SATORU Gojo. He is a very interesting fellow. Though his decision to compete with you for the place of captain is putting a wrench in some of my plans. Ichimaru Jin was not the only one working for Aizen. His second subordinate was already a captain. If Jin also got ranked as one, it would mean that he had 2 captains under him. This would have, without a doubt, eased most of his subsequent actions. Should we just eliminate him? Jin proposed calmly. He had no qualms about killing the competition. After all, he reached his current rank by secretly killing those above him. Aizen pondered a little before giving a faint smile. No. He is too much of a high-profile target and his relationship with many of the other captains is unusual. If we kill him, the investigation force will be quite large. Until now, hundreds of Shinigami and thousands of civilians were sacrificed for the fruits of research. The main reason he still managed to avoid being caught until now, aside from the utter incompetence of the government and the power of his Shikai, was because he generally avoided targeting high-profile targets. The only time he did not respect this rule was about 60 years ago when he plotted against more than 8 high-ranked members of the Soul Society. 4 of them were captains, while another was the vice-captain of the Kido Corps. Meanwhile, the other 3 were all vice-captains of the Gote 13. As if it wasn't enough, he had indirectly managed to pull down 2 other captains as well as the leader of the Kido Corps in the same plot. Now, those highly loyal soldiers were considered traitors and fugitives, while he was lauded as a gentle and friendly captain loved by all. The Gote 13 always had 13 captains, and in one night, he had made 6 captains, 3 vice captains, and the 2 highest cadres of an organization equal to the Gote 13 become wanted fugitives. Haha, this is all so ridiculous it's funny. The Soul Society was sick. An organization full of cancerous tumors that could not be erased, and the reason. That fake king. Just thinking about that thing made his blood boil in anger and disgust. How are our researches about the second Hogyoku? Jin ignored the pressure that was steadily weighing down on him. Even though he had achieved Bankai and was sure that he could kill most captains if he took them by surprise, he was still unable to see the limit of Aizen's strength. We have been searching in the human world but nothing. The whereabouts of Kazuki Urahara remain unknown. The same goes for those who underwent holification. Hearing this, Aizen sighed. Well, I am not surprised. Kazuki is the only one I consider my equal in terms of intellect. Having him outside of the Soul Society is already good enough. Chuckling, he turned around and began to walk toward the secret underground he had created for his experiment. Watching him leave, Jin asked once again, what about the current experiment? Aizen stopped and answered without turning around. Since Satoru Gojo will interfere, we can already assume that Metastasia is dead. Thankfully I implemented a function that will immediately send a part of his soul to go toward the Hueco Mundo. It's time to place the first steps for another plan of mine. Jin's eyes narrowed further, something that should have been impossible. He understood the implication of Aizen's words more than anyone. Are we going to begin the last step of the preparations? Added Nobleman at. Answering so, he began walking again. Indeed. While my Hogyoku is incomplete and unable to allow me to reach my final goal, its current level is enough to work on Mano's ranked hollows. It's time to begin the first phase of my greatest project. Let's call it Project Espada. Chapter 69. Selfish Observation. Rukongai. West District. Currently, 3 Shinigami, 2 women, and 1 man were hiding in a cave while paying attention to their surroundings. The team consisted of Rukia and 2 other Shinigami of the 13th Division. How should we proceed, squad leader? Rukia asked the second woman on the team. Even though that woman only had the 17th seat, she was still a seated officer and as such, took control of their little teams. The woman, a slime blue-haired one, frowned as she pondered a little. She honestly did not wish to have Rukia Kuchiki in her team. She still couldn't understand why they had accepted to let this newbie participate in such a dangerous mission. Ignoring Rukia, she addressed the sole man in the team, a tall but rugged middle-aged man. Muhei, I want you to stay beside Kuchiki and protect her at all cost. Kuchiki, please do not move far away from us. Understood. Rukia smiled bitterly before nodding. Understood. Added Nobleman at. She understood that the squad leader had nothing against her personally. Her identity was just too sensitive. Even though she had awakened her Shikai and even though she had managed to settle a little in the 13th Division, at the end of the day, in their eyes, she would always be a member of the Kuchiki family first before being a soldier like them. Even so, she couldn't help but feel disappointed. Then, since this is done, let's summarize the situation. Aside from 3rd seat Satoru Gojo and 3rd seat Miyako Shiba, there are actually 4 teams exploring the zone as well as different districts. We will sweep everything from here until the 80th. Our goal is not fighting. Should anything happen, Kuchiki, you will be the first one to flee. We will entrust you with our hell butterflies. Rukia opened her eyes wide, clearly stunned. Ignoring her expression, the squad leader stood up and walked away. On the side, Muhei also stood up and patted Rukia's back. Even though she is a little gruff, she doesn't mean anything bad. Vice Captain Kyan assured us about your skills, but we still need to take care of the newbie, right? Understood. This time, there was more strength in her words. Hey, this was a rather cute moment. But damn, those guys planted so many death flags. Ha ha ha. Sitting on the edge of a cliff, a few kilometers away from the previous team, Gojo could be seen chuckling lightly. Is it really all right? Standing beside him, Miyako murmured, worry clearly evident in her voice. Initially, she should have moved with her own team and Rukia would have followed her, but at the last moment, Gojo had proposed that the 2 of them move in one team. Is he really able to observe everything from here? Even for her, sensing Reiatsu at such a great distance was complicated and she needed immense focus. This was even more so since all the teams were moving stealthily. But it seemed that the man sitting beside her could not only feel their reiatsu, he seemed to also see them. Those eyes are really beautiful. She could more or less understand why, despite all the bad rumors about him, there were still women falling into his clutches. Gojo, meanwhile, chuckled and waved his hand disinterestedly. Don't mind it, don't mind it. Simply see this as a little test. You guys can't keep cuddling Rukia forever after all. Of course, this wasn't all. He had already pinpointed the location of the variant hollow thanks to his eyes, and he only had one word to describe what he saw. Ugly. Then again, it was still less ugly than 80% of the curses in his old world. Now then, what should I do? The only reason he still didn't act was that he was curious about what kind of skills that hollow had. From the energy level, that thing was weaker than a vice captain, but still a match for a normal third seat. How could such a strong hollow enter undetected in the Soul Society? After all, even though the Rukongai was plagued with regular hollow attacks, those hollows were always bottom feeders that even new recruits could deal with easily. This proved that there was indeed someone pulling the strings in the Soul Society. One of the reasons he was still hesitating was because he was considering how much he should involve himself in this quagmire. This had absolutely nothing to do with him after all. He did not particularly care about the fact that there were traitors in the Soul Society. It wasn't as if he was particularly loyal either. As for the fact that the traitor or traitors had most likely caused the death of many Shinigami and civilians once again, what did it have to do with him? Gojo cared little for people not related to him. He would never fall so low as to intentionally harm people drastically weaker than him, but he would not go out of his way to save them either. Thinking idly about such topics, he hummed gently while observing the different Shinigami and the way they worked. Since he was used to working with battle junkies like the members of the 11th Division or cold assassins like those of the 2nd, he had to admit that he was rather disappointed. Even though they did not lack discipline and experience, they were without a doubt vastly inferior to the other divisions on average. This most likely stemmed from the fact that Jashiro Yukitaki's disease was not a secret in the Soul Society. Because of this, few promising recruits would choose to join the 13th Division if they had another choice. Gojo could understand that, at the end of the day, few Shinigami really had a deep sense of justice. Most members of the Gotei 13 were from the Rukongai, and rather than justice, what they wished for was to be safe under a mighty and powerful being. Few hours went like this while he sometimes discussed with Miyako before his attention was attracted by the scene that was playing. It's such a pain, looking out for the weak. Pardon. Haha. Forget it. I will do as much as I am paid for. Ignoring the confused Miyako, Gojo stood up. What is happening? Nah, I am just surprised at the power of the flags planted. It hasn't even been that long. Oh well. Gojo joked around as he watched the team of Rukia advance slowly in the forest without knowing that they were being followed by the one they were supposed to hunt. Of course, Gojo had placed her team close to the hollow intentionally, but it shouldn't have happened so fast. So not only is it stronger than average, its senses are also at a higher level. He thought calmly. Even though the distance between the hollows and his current position was quite far, he did not worry. Not only could he move far faster than he could do 5 years ago, but more than anything, he did not even need to move. Even though he was tens of kilometers away, one attack was all he needed to erase that monster. Though he would most likely erase the forest alongside it. But this wouldn't be fun. He wished to see the skills of that hollow. Otherwise, this would have simply been a waste of time. Now then, I really hope you will manage to entertain me enough. Chapter 70. Grand Entrance. A few minutes ago, in a hidden cavern, below a very large tree, red tentacles could be seen wriggling while a masked six-limbed green monster was crawling around, munching on the remains of a corpse. All around him, heaps of body parts could be seen, some half-eaten, discarded all around. Counting the number of victims would be difficult, but there was no denying that this number was large, very large. Spitting the small hand, clearly that of a child, that was in its mouth, the spider-like monster raised its masked face covered in flame patterns and began to sniff. After a while, a red glow shined in the empty socket where its eyes should have been, and it murmured. Fresh meat. 2 of them don't smell too bright though. But the third one, letting out a creepy laugh, it began to salivate at the prospect of eating such rich spiritual food. Then, without further ado, it left the cavern, stepping on the detached head of a young boy, his face fixed in an expression of horror, demonstrating the pain and suffering he must have felt as he was slowly eaten alive. Glancing at that face, the hollow felt a sense of twisted satisfaction filling the hole that was his heart. He felt even more pleasure when he thought about its future victims. I can't wait. Slowly blending in the shadow and hiding all its reiatsu, it rushed with glee towards its target. This is going to be fun. It thought in excitement. Dash dash dash. A few minutes later, observing its prey from the shadows, the hollow rapidly keyed in on his main target. It was a black-haired woman with a childlike body. She stood between two others. One man and a woman. What it could not understand was why the strongest out of the three was being protected. But it did not matter. He would end the two weaker ones swiftly and then bask in the cries of pain and despair of the third one. Chuckling to itself, he put himself in the best position and waited. Dash dash dash. Rukia felt uneasy. She did not know why, but since a few moments ago, she felt as if she was being stared at by a starved beast. She could not say whether this stress was the result of her fear and lack of experience, or really the result of her catching the trace of an enemy, but she did not wish to be careless. She understood very well that this was her best chance. If she did not manage to show off a little, she would most likely be put in the reserve for 3 or 4 decades, then sent to some forsaken city in the human world. A cushy job with almost no responsibility. Tightening her grip on her sword, she looked warily at her surroundings. She wasn't the only one. Both the squad leader and Muhei were prepared to react at any moment. Compared to her though, they were clearly much calmer and at the same time did not look left and right like her. For Shinigami, using their own eyes to search for their enemies was proof of a lack of experience. Battles between high-ranked Shinigami were all at a speed surpassing that of sound and could span tens of kilometers. If scrubs like them relied on their eyes to follow the fight, they would get killed without even understanding what had happened. This was why they needed to rely on their abilities to feel reiatsu more than anything else. This was the consensus between most Shinigami. This was also why the only one who managed to see it was Rukia. All the hair on her body suddenly stood as terror gripped her. A red tentacle rushing at a speed so high they could not react, while cleverly placing itself at the blind spot of her squad leader. Despite this, there was absolutely no leakage of reiatsu, showing how powerful the stealth ability of the one attacking was. Rukia moved more by instinct than rational thought, the years of training under Kai and Shiba, showing its results. Bakugo number 8. Seiki, 1. A small blue orb formed between her squad leader and the tentacle that had threatened to skewer her. This was a low-sequence Hado with limited use. What's more, with her current level and the lack of incantations, Rukia understood very well that it could not completely stop the attack. As she thought, the moment the tentacle hit the orb, it was barely stopped for 1 second. But 1 second was more than enough. The other two immediately reacted. Using Shunpo to move as fast as possible, the squad leader avoided the attack while taking out her sword and swung it hard. Roar. Shishi. 2. Boom. The slim katana immediately changed into a large greatsword and cut the tentacle in two while creating wide cracks on the ground after the impact. Meanwhile, using the cover of the dust that was raised, Muhei released his hell butterfly and hid it so that it could record the fight as much as possible without getting discovered in case none of them managed to escape. At the same time, he took a black stick out of the backpack on his back and filled it with reiatsu. *FSSHH. A red flare flew out of the stick and went higher and higher until it exploded, thereby warning all the other teams about the presence of the hollow in the vicinity. Rukia, on the side, wasn't idle. Dance. Soda no Shirayuki. The moment her sword changed into its crystalline appearance, Rukia pierced the sword in the direction of the enemy who still didn't appear. Tsugi no Mai. Hakuren. 3. A torrent of snow formed at the tip of her sword and rushed in the direction she pointed at. Seeing her attack, the squad leader couldn't help but curse as she used her Shunpo at max power. She had created that smokescreen to give some time for Rukia to flee. Not attack in an obviously wrong direction. As she thought, the moment she rushed, she could see another tentacle attacking Rukia. Rukia. Behind you. Rukia heard her squad leader scream but had no time to react. She had just released her technique, her body was still in what could be called a cool-down period. Normally, she would only need an instant to be able to move again, but the enemy clearly had an accurate grasp on the timing. Moreover, from the direction of the attack that was completely opposite to the first one, it was clear that the first attack had just been a feint. I have been too rash. From the corner of her eyes, she could see her squad leader running to help her. She could also see Muhei trying to prepare Aikido. But all of this would be useless. Determination grew in Rukia's eyes, even though she could barely move, she tried her best to shift her body as much as possible. This attack wasn't aimed at any fatal spot, but she would have been pretty much rendered helpless if it landed. That's why she was ready to sacrifice an arm. But, just as the attack was about to land, whoosh, she was blinded by a curtain of light. It was then followed by the sound of an explosion so loud she felt as if her ears were about to fall off. This state lasted a few short seconds before she could finally see and hear again. The situation in the forest, though, was completely different. A deep trench could be seen now in front of her. Sigh. I initially wanted to let you get some experience. But your brother would hunt me to death if I let you get killed. Just as she was getting more confused about the situation, a bored voice she could easily recognize sounded next to her. Gojo. The one and only. There, right next to her, she could see Gojo standing. This time, his face was not covered by a blindfold, and she could not help but become mesmerized by his shining blue eyes. Just as she was about to ask her what was going on. Who are you? A guttural voice sounded a little farther from the bush as a disgusting spider-like monster crawled out of the bush. Looking at that monster, Rukia could not help but feel a chill. Now that the monster wasn't hiding anymore, she could feel the incredible pressure it was emitting. Clearly, he had just been playing around with them previously. It could have wiped them out without resorting to any tricks. Gojo, clearly unimpressed by the hollow, yawned. Me, haha. Let's just say that I will become your worst nightmare. 1. Seiki equals repulsion. 2. Shishi equals lion. 3. Tsugi no Mai. Hakuren equals next dance, white ripple. Chapter 71. WHO is the true monster. In the forest, an oppressive silence weighed on everyone, almost everyone at least. Gojo just found the situation distasteful. Initially, he had decided to watch the show and see how Rukia would deal with it. He believed in practice more than theory. Even if she got wounded, even if she lost a limb, he could help her grow it back by recreating the matter that made up her body. His Shikai gave him a near god-like control over spiritual energies. Recreating his own body was nothing complicated, and even though doing so for others was without a doubt more difficult, it was just a matter of how much effort he was willing to put in. But after witnessing the first attack of that hollow, he was forced to throw his training plan to the window. I can't let her or any of them get wounded. He hadn't been paying attention at first when the hollow was still in the cave, since he had been distracted by the disgusting scene of the massacre and body parts thrown all around, but it seemed that a part of the soul of the hollow was fused in those tentacles. This reminded him of the way some curses could attach themselves to humans and possess them, or at least take control of their bodies. Of course, the laws of the two worlds were different, and perhaps he was worrying for nothing, but since those Shinigami were part of his team for the mission, it was his duty to avoid putting them in unnecessary difficult situations. More than anything, it was a question of pride. He had just bragged how everything was under control, so it would be quite lame if someone died soon after. They could go die in another mission he wasn't part of later. Honestly, I'm kinda disappointed in you. It was hard to say if he was addressing Rukia or the hollow. I mean, you have so much potential, and this is all you amount to after 5 years of training. Shaking his head, Gojo put his hand in his pocket and began to advance. Watch and listen. How long has it been since he could play the teacher? How could he let such an occasion pass? It's showtime. Do not underestimate me. The hollow roared before keeping its maw wide open. A scarlet orb of energy condensed in front of the hollows, then die. It was fired directly at full power towards Gojo. This was a Sero, the most used technique of high-ranked hollows. Contrary to the complexity of Kido that Shinigami pursued, hollows knew only one thing. The bigger the better. Looking at the energy beam flying toward him, Gojo tilted his head. Underestimating you? Nah. Then, under the astonished eyes of all people present, he slowly raised his hand before swatting the Sero aside as if it was nothing. Boom. When the Sero landed, everything in 100 meters radius was erased. Even though the center of the explosion was quite far from them, Rukia could still clearly feel the wave of energy. See, I have perfectly grasped your strength, and the result is. Gojo brought his thumbs down while a grin split his face. You are far weaker than I thought. Quote exclamation mark exclamation mark exclamation mark quote. The other three Shinigami could only open their eyes wide at this declaration. He is weak. Rukia gulped while watching the hollow and threw a glance at Gojo. There was no way this hollow was weak. At the very least, she was sure that not even Miyako could have handled it. She had heard many rumors about Gojo since he left the academy. But only by seeing for herself was she able to understand just how absurdly strong he was. Bastard. The hollow. Metastasia, seethed with anger. How dare he? He was his master's most beautiful creation. Even though he could not remember who his creator was, he believed it was the most absolute being in this world. Enraged, it used all its remaining tentacles and swiped them at not only Gojo, but also at the other three who were still in the vicinity. Despite its rage, Metastasia understood quite clearly that it was simply no match for the one in front of it. Even though they had only exchanged a few moves, the difference in power was made clear. But, there were many ways to win even against someone stronger. Its tentacles weren't simply meant to attack. As long as it wounded at least one of them, it could infect their minds and bodies by fusing their souls with theirs. It knew that Shinigami were incredibly loyal to each other. Surely they would not kill each other. What's more, if I can get his body. From the information in its minds, it knew that its technique would be useless against captains of the Soul Society. Their souls were simply too powerful. But, the one in front of it did not wear the white cloak. It's possible. What's more, it had another trump card. Meanwhile, watching all this, Gojo could only feel bored. Lately, his 6 eyes have been slowly getting stronger. It all began the moment he unlocked his Shikai. It seemed that the power of his eyes was related to the power of his soul. Currently, Gojo could convert 1 instant into more than 3 minutes. It wouldn't be a mistake to say that he was living in a different world from most people. Thankfully, this power of his was something he could control, otherwise he would have gone crazy. But still, fighting against enemies so much slower than him was nothing more than a pain. Suddenly, just as the attacks were about to land, they were all stopped by a spinning translucent yellow shield. Rukia's breath nearly stopped as she watched the tentacle stopping just a few centimeters away from her face. At the same time, she could not understand what had just happened. No matter how she saw it, what he had just used was Aikido. More precisely, it was Bakudo number 39, Enkozen 1. But this shouldn't have been possible. Not only did he create a dozen shields in a fraction of a second, but he did not even use any incantations, nor did he use the name of the spell. This could only mean one thing. SATORU Gojo was at the master rank in terms of Kido. Rukia, what do you think was your first mistake? Ignoring the caged hollow, Gojo asked Rukia calmly. You did not clearly tell your teammates what your skills were. Even though Sota no Shirayuki was renowned as the most beautiful Shikai in Soul Society, it didn't mean that its abilities were equally known. Since your leader did not know your power, she operated and used a flawed formation from the start. Saying so, Gojo raised his index, a spinning fireball formed above it before being thrown at the hollow. Gah! The heat was so high that Rukia was already sweating. Meanwhile, the hollow was being charred and released a high-pitched scream of pain. Second mistake. After you managed to repel the first attack, the first thing you should have done was to regroup and cover the back of either of your comrades. After the fire stopped burning the hollow, Gojo opened his hand wide and a green light covered the hollow, while slowly healing all its wounds. If any of the 4th Division members had been present, they would have sworn at this sight. Healing a hollow was accepted to be fundamentally impossible because, while their Raryoku and Reiatsu were the same in essence, there existed too many little differences. The third mistake you made was to use a skill you obviously did not master completely in a setting that allowed room for no mistakes. If I did not intervene, you would have been seriously maimed. Once it seemed that the hollow was sufficiently healed, the green light was replaced by pale white lightning. Stop. All the hollow could do was scream and beg, but when it tried to move, chains of light appeared out of thin air and chained him down. Rukia did not know what she should feel. Should she be ashamed because of the mistakes she made? Or amazed at the incredible display of skill and power? Or simply frightened at the callous and uncaring way he was torturing another being? Of course, some would say that this wasn't your fault. You are just a newbie, this is your first true mission. You did pretty alright for the first time, and you know what? Even though they aren't really wrong, absolutely never listen to them. Gojo chuckled as he healed the hollow once again, twitching and writhing on the ground. Do you know the difference between the weak and the strong? 3 lances of light formed in the air above the hollow before falling down and nailing it on the ground. Quote. Exclamation mark quote. This time, Rukia and the other 2 had to actually cover their ears. The screams had been so high-pitched that they could hear nothing else. Once it slumped powerlessly on the ground, Rukia asked while trembling. What happened? Oh, that. Don't pay attention. What I just did is the equivalent of injecting acid directly into the veins, it must have hurt. Now then, where was I again? Oh yeah, the difference between the weak and the strong. Chuckling, he walked slowly toward the hollow. You see, Rukia, When something happens, the weak always try to reject their faults on something else. Meanwhile, for the strong, searching for someone to blame is just a pain. Dash dash dash. Metastasia could not understand what was happening. How could it be possible? How was it possible for the difference in strength between the two of them to be that huge? At Nobleman at. It had been created to be the perfect counter for Shinigami. As long as someone used their swords on its body, the sword would crumble. Even though it could only use this skill once a day, it would have been enough. Even without that, it could have contaminated any of the others and taken over their bodies. But, in the end, it could do nothing. And the pain. It hurt so much. How could it hurt so much? Right now, it did not fancy any hope of escaping. All it wished for was to die, to vanish and never see that man again. To finally stop that pain that seemed to grind all its bones to dust and set its veins ablaze. Hello. Hello. Hey, Mr. Hollow, you don't seem to be in good shape. What might have happened? Perhaps some handsome, strong, intelligent, and kind man passed and brought retribution. The Hollow's whole body trembled a little. Whether it was out of anger, indignation, or fear was unknown. It hurts, right? You want it to end, right? Then beg me. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. A few seconds later, having come to a decision, the Hollow raised its head with difficulty and looked at the silver-haired man standing a few meters away. I beg you. Please, just end me. Please. It took all its strength to utter those words that completely crushed its pride. But at the same time, it was relieved. Finally. Now it could finally rest. At least that was it thought, but unfortunately for it, I refuse. Two cold and utterly merciless words crushed its renewed hope. Ah. Crouching down next to it, Gojo murmured. How was it? How sweet was your short moment of hope? Hollows were beings who lost their hearts. The very definition of despair. But for the first time, Metastasia understood now. True despair wasn't the lack of hope. Rather, it was the feeling of utter helplessness as you watched the seed of hope getting ruthlessly smashed in front of you. Looking at the sinister smile plastered on the face, contrasting with the cold emotionless gaze of the man standing in front of it, Metastasia shivered. A deep primal fear seized its empty heart. It was sure of it. Out of the two of them, the true monster was not it. Chapter 72. A New Road. After this, Gojo proceeded to kill the Hollow in front of Rukia and the other two. The other teams and Miyako finally reached the place and were also able to witness its death. Even though none of them had been able to observe the entire fight, the traces of destruction all over the place spoke volumes of what had happened. Well. Since everyone's here, I guess the scouting mission changed into an extermination one. Now that the job is done, I will take my leave. Without waiting for them to utter a word, Gojo began to walk away. Then, he stopped and turned towards Miyako. Ah, I almost forgot. Go northeast for a few hundred meters. You will find the cave that Hollow was inhabiting. Though, I advise you to not let faint-hearted people follow you. Miyako frowned before a hint of sadness flashed in her eyes. Over the few decades since she entered the 13th Division, she had chased after many Hollows who had snuck into the Rukongai. She could already more or less guess what they would find. Sighing, she bowed at his departing back. She, more than anyone, could feel the power of that Hollow. If her team had engaged it, the most likely result would have been a near or complete wipeout. Thank you for everything. I hope you will visit the Shiba compound if you are free. My husband would be happy to make a new friend. She was thankful from the bottom of her heart. Even though she was ready to die at any moment, she had nothing against staying alive a little longer. Ha. I will think about it. Oh, before I forget. Rukia. Yes. Tell your brother I have something to discuss with him. Now then. Ciao. Without waiting for Rukia to answer, Gojo vanished. At Nobleman at. Standing now alone in the clearing with her entire team, Miyako hesitated briefly before making a decision. Rukia. Come with us. Miyako did not know how Rukia would react after what she might see in that cavern. But they could not keep treating her like a baby. Even if her brother did not wish for her to participate in missions, Rukia had to at least understand one of the reasons why Shinigami fought. After this, whether she would despair and abandon her sword or be more resolute to fight. The choice will be hers alone. Let's go. Yes. A few minutes after all the Shinigami went away, a silver-haired man appeared in the same place. Why did you bother playing such a convoluted act? A girly voice sounded in his head. Hey, I have a conscience, you know. I just wanted them to find the bodies and at least bury them. Well, You were indeed very angry back then. It's rare for you to torture your opponent. Well, I just believe in the law of karma. Since he likes torturing people so much, he should also enjoy some torture. Laughing, Gojo walked until he reached the place where the hollow had been killed. Stretching his hand, he seemed to hold onto a handle and pulled it away. Space seemed to distort as the scene blurred before revealing a very different scene. The hollow, still pinned to the ground. Gojo had never killed the hollow in the first place. All of it had been an illusion. This was thanks to him using a rather useful Bakudo number 26 Kyoko, one that allowed the user to distort light around themselves. It could also hide Reiatsu and Raryoku. The perfect technique for stealth. It became even more so after Gojo slightly tweaked it and allowed it to not only distort light but also sound. That's why, no matter how the hollow screamed, no one noticed it. Finally, the spears of light he had used to pin it were made out of reishi. Shinigami's already found it difficult to feel reishi in the human world where it was sparse and easy to discern. In a place like the Soul Society where absolutely everything was made out of reishi, they might as well be blind. So, what will you do with that fugly thing? Firstly, compared to curses, this one is pretty cute. Secondly, what's the best way to make friends with a crazy scientist? You send him something to study. This was why Gojo had staged this play. Whoever they were, the culprits were no small matter. He wasn't sure what they would do if it was known to everyone that the hollow was about to be studied. Right now though, he had a dozen witnesses that could prove that the hollow was dead. With that, it wouldn't be a problem to at least discerning and understand more what those variants were. Well, let's go to the 12th. He hadn't given up on having Mayuri work for him. There was simply too much that depended on it. Seraiti, 12th Division. This time, Gojo entered from the main gate without trying to hide. Thanks to this, rather than the hidden laboratory of the research center, he had been directed to the office of the captain. Surprisingly, the office was rather neat. In Gojo's opinion, the office of a mad scientist should have been completely full of junk and things that could only be understood by equally mad scientists. Once he took a seat, he didn't have to wait long before the captain entered. Hello, your face is as scary as always. Did no one ever tell you you could most likely make children cry with just a glance? A thick vein pulsed on Mayuri's forehead. Did you come only to mock me, Satoru Gojo? Sigh, people nowadays can't even take a small joke. Mayuri fought the urge to scream in frustration. Get on with your business. Otherwise, get out. Ha ha ha. Calm down. I didn't come just to mess with you even though it's really amusing to do so. But rather, I came because I wanted to show you something that might interest you. Mayuri calmed down before narrowing his eyes. I already refused to work for you. Hey, don't worry, I won't ask you to work for me. Then, what do you want in exchange for whatever you are sending to me? No matter how much he despised the man named Satoru Gojo, Mayuri had to begrudgingly accept that the man was extremely skilled. If that man said that he found something interesting, then it would be worth taking a look. Not much. Firstly, I want you to share whatever discovery you make. And, I want to read old records about the Dongai. Seraiti, Kuchiki family mansion. The Kuchiki family was one of the 4 great noble families of the Seraiti and also one of the richest. It was also ranked first out of the 4, effectively making it the strongest family in the Soul Society. The manor of the Kuchiki family was so vast that Byakuya even had rivers flowing past his river chambers. Currently, writing on a scroll, he was listening to Rukia recounting the day's events. From the way she kept stammering while talking to him, he knew that she still felt awkward around him. Something that he had very little control of. After all, every time he looked at her face, he was reminded of the death of his wife. When, on her deathbed, she had asked him to find her sister and take care of her, he had never thought that the two would resemble each other so much. When Rukia reached the part where they found the dismembered bodies of the victims, he could feel how distressed she was. Byakuya did not know what he should say to her. He wanted to tell her that everything would be alright. But, like Rukia, he was equally awkward with her and did not know how to express his concerns. Which was why all he answered with was, I see. He couldn't help but berate himself the moment those words were uttered. Clearly, Rukia would think that he did not care about her day and she was bothering him. It was his order that at the end of each day, she would report everything that had happened to her. Of course, he would regularly receive reports about her situation in the 13th Division, but it always made him happy to hear it directly from her. Byakuya Kuchiki was an awkward man. A man who cared deeply for his sister but did not know how to express himself. It was when he was thinking that Rukia continued. Ni-sama. Gojo asked me to warn you that he wished to pay you a visit. Oh. Did he say when he would come? No. I see. No matter. I must express my gratitude for the protection he extended to you. So I will wait. The relationship between Byakuya and Gojo was even more difficult to explain than the one between the siblings. Even then, Byakuya trusted the power of that man. It was then that Rukia hesitated before finally asking. Ni-sama. What do you think of his words? You mean about the difference between the strong and the weak? Yes. I believe the same. Weak people always project the fault of their own failures to external reasons. No matter what the situation, they always find an excuse to explain their failures. Such people are worthless and disgraceful. There's nothing to be ashamed of regarding failure. Failing simply means you weren't good enough, and as such, you need to work harder. Always ask yourself, could I have done better? Only then can you become stronger. Quote. Quote. This is even more so for us. Noblesse oblige. We, as the highest ranked nobles, must live a life befitting of the honor we were given. Weakness is not a sin. But the act of wallowing in one's own weakness is the greatest sin in my eyes. Byakuya stopped talking and walked towards the window of the room to admire his river. You can leave now. He waited, but did not hear her departing footsteps. What might be the problem? Ni-sama. I wished to become strong. I had thought that after reaching the Shikai, I had become someone strong. But today, while watching him fight, I understood that I still have a long way before me. Please. Byakuya felt conflicted. He wished to tell her it was alright. That she did not have to fight. He wished to tell her that he could take care of her. That she could leave everything to her big brother. But doing so would mean spitting on her new resolve. Since he could not stop her from investing herself in Shinigami work. Then he would make sure she would be strong enough to not die. We will begin tomorrow at dawn. Rukia showed an expression of delight as she bowed to his back. Yes. Chapter 73. Different steps toward evolution. Oh, so Metastasia was really killed. Sitting on the captain's seat, Aizen asked with surprise. A bewildered expression flashing in his eyes. He wasn't surprised at the fact that this hollow got killed. The hollow was too aggressive, so it was only a matter of time before he caught the attention of the 13th Division. Aizen had initially created him because he wished to know if the hollow could possess and fuse with a vice captain like he had theorized and potentially do the same with a captain-level Shinigami. What's more, Metastasia had been installed with a failsafe that would transfer all his information and power to a new experiment of his back in the Hueco Mundo. An artificial Arrancar. Aizen had a deep understanding of the hollows. The normal path of a hollow was to first consume as much as possible. Then to consume each other. From this process, a Manos Grande of the first step, a Jillian, would be born. Jillians were an agglomeration of thousands upon thousands of souls. Each with their own memories, personalities, and all the baggage. After years of fighting between the different personalities, one soul would finally take control. This would usher in the birth of an Ejukas. In terms of pure spiritual power, Ejukas were already near the level of an ordinary captain. And the last step to Vasto Lord was more a matter of luck than anything. If an Ejukas wished to become a Vasto Lord, not only did it need to fight and eat even more Ejukas, it also needed to avoid being eaten. If even the slightest bit of its body was taken out, then it would forever stay as an Ejukas. From Aizen's study, he believed that this was because even if Ejukas had one will, they were still the result of hundreds of souls fused in a whole. By having a part of their body eaten, it meant that they lost this perfect equilibrium, blocking all paths for further evolution. But at the same time, it stopped all paths from further devolution. Because unharmed Ejukas could at any moment lose control and revert to being mindless monsters as Jillians. If an Ejukas was lucky enough to fulfill all the conditions, it would become a Vasto Lord. A monster that was closest to a human in appearance. All Vasto Lord were equal to captains. Some of them were even slightly superior. This was the normal path towards power for the hollows. At Nobleman at. But Aizen had discovered that some hollows could take an alternative path. That of becoming Arrancar. Any hollows, even those inferior to Jillians, could become an Arrancar. What fascinated Aizen the most was that in essence, Arrancar were basically the closest existence to Shinigami. Simply said, Arrancar were beings with Shinigami-like powers. All they lacked was a Zanpakuto and there would be basically no difference. Even to this day, Aizen had difficulty understanding how Arrancars worked. Natural Arrancars were born from hollows breaking their masks. But the mask was also the weakness of hollows. Death or evolution. This was truly something he could only observe with admiration. Even though those natural Arankar were not necessarily stronger than their hollow counterparts, they had far higher potential. This was the greatest wish of Aizen. In the Soul Society, aside from a few monsters like the captain of the 1st Division, Genryusai Yamamoto, Yakiru Unohana or the captain of Division 0, Ikibe Hayasube, Aizen rightfully believed that he had no equal. In fact, if he could stop them from using their Bankai, he had nothing to fear from them. As he was now, he did not even need his Zanpakuto if he wished to utterly destroy a captain. He was strong. He was incredibly strong. But it was his limit. No matter how much he trained, he could never overcome this limit. All Shinigami had a limit. Some had higher limits than the others, and his had been far higher than most. In the past, he did not mind that limit. He was happy to have reached the highest possible level available for a Shinigami. But after seeing that thing, a being of such level reduced to being nothing more than the linchpin between the worlds. To think that such a disgusting being was the respected king of the Soul Society. How utterly ridiculous. He loathed it. He wished to destroy that fake god and take its place. But he had reached his limits. All he had to do then was just to break it. This was how the creation of the Hogyoku came about. This was how his plan to fuse hollows and Shinigami powers in one was born. Once I find the Hogyoku created by Kazuki, I will become the new god. But it seemed that his steps towards godhood were being hampered. Had it been anyone else who killed Metastasia, Aizen would have believed that the failsafe not working was a result of his own mistake. Even though he was prideful, as a scientist he knew very well that one should never fear mistakes. But, the one who killed Metastasia was SATORU Gojo. Aizen's narrowed. He was someone extremely distrustful by nature. He would rather doubt everything than blindly believe and fail. Perhaps it's time to take care of him. Until now he had hesitated because Gojo had been too high profile. The reward for killing him did not cover the potential loss. Now though light flashed as he adjusted his plans. Firstly, let's make him go to Earth for a mission. Once Gojo was on Earth, what would it have to do with him even if for some reason 20 or so Ajukas decided to visit Earth? Back in Gojo's house. Achoo. Snort. I wonder who is talking behind my back. I hope it's a beautiful girl. Chapter 74. Past. After haggling a little bit with Mayuri and getting him to keep the fact that the hollow was alive as a secret, Gojo left the territory of the 12th Division quite happily. He, of course, did not believe in Mayuri at all. But, he was overlooking the whole situation with the mindset of not really caring about the results. If after a few years the soft method didn't work, Gojo would simply use more forceful means and steal all the research he needed before leaving. How could he lose when he could simply flip the board whenever he wished? Since the mission had ended quite swiftly, it was still just the middle of the day. As such, Gojo decided to go work and heal some poor bastard to pass time. After all, even though he wasn't the leader of a healing squad, he was still the third seat. He had to at least look like he was doing his job. There was also the fact that passing time with a bunch of sexy nurses fawning over him was quite enjoyable, to say the least. 4th Division. Unohana's private quarter. Sitting peacefully in her backyard, with her knees gathered under her and a bottle of alcohol on her right, Unohana was gazing peacefully at the moon. The garden in her backyard had nothing particularly special. A small lake filled with 3 koi fish of different colors, a hollowed bamboo cane that regularly hit against a rock and produced a gentle sound and beautiful vegetation. All in all, it was the perfect place for her to relax a little. Suddenly, in an incredible burst of speed, she took her sword that was laying on her left, unsheathing it, before raising herself on one knee and swinging it with all her might. All these series of movements were done in such a graceful and beautiful way it seemed like a work of art. Clang. The sound of swords clashing sounded in the peaceful night before being replaced by a voice speaking with a joking tone. Oh ho, it's me, your cute and handsome student. Showing an unsurprised expression, Unohana sighed and lowered her sword. How many times do I have to tell you? It's impolite to intrude unannounced in the house of a lady. I also remember telling you that you could never sneak up on me. Putting back her zanpakuto in its sheath, she placed her sword close to her futon and put her hand in her loose hair to sweep it. Hey, and I remember telling you I would prove you wrong one day. There is nothing I cannot do, only things I do not wish to do. Still, you really have the instincts of a beast. When he previously tried to sneak up on her, not only was he coated in reishi, making it impossible for any normal Shinigami to feel him, but he also used all techniques possible to hide any sounds or scent he could emit. Well, I guess comparing her to a normal Shinigami is an insult. The fact that despite this, Hana could always find him even when sleeping spoke of how keen her senses were. And yeah, he had once tried to sneak up on her while she was sleeping. Sadly, he failed and got punished by having to heal people non-stop for an entire week. Thinking about this, he took another look at her and was unable to avert his gaze for a few seconds. Currently, she was not wearing her usual captain cloak and Shinigami uniform. Rather, she was only clad in a long white, and rather loose kimono. Despite what her usual uniform suggested, Hana was quite well endowed, and her current attire accentuated her deep cleavage. Since he was standing and looking down on her, he had the first seat for quite a show. Liking what you see, taking his gaze away from her chest, Gojo saw her smile and immediately understood that he might receive another weird punishment at this rate. As such, he simply told the truth. Indeed, I do really like what I am seeing. You are very beautiful. Gojo gave a theatrical bow as he complimented her wholeheartedly. He had long noticed it, but it seemed that Hana was rather weak against straightforward people. As expected, the tension from her shoulders loosened as she gave a wry smile. Your tongue is as sweet as your tooth. Shaking her head, she continued, well, now that you are here, you might as well sit down. At least I will have a partner to drink with. Gojo did not particularly enjoy alcohol. One of his greatest strengths was his brain and his ability to process information. So, drinking something that lowered his ability to think, even for a short while, was something he generally avoided. Thankfully, Hana thought the same way. He knew that what Hana was drinking had an extremely low percentage and was more of a sweet wine than anything. Sitting close to her, he began to chat a little with her, while taking a light sip of the drink he was offered. So, what brought you down like this? It was clear that Hana was not in the greatest mood possible currently. Pausing a little, Hana seemed to deliberate whether she should explain or not, before nodding to herself. I never told you how I became a criminal, did I? At Nobleman at. Well, you are rarely forthright with your past. Which is perfectly understandable, everyone has their own secrets. Gojo shrugged as answered her. He had never really been big on sharing secrets and the like. The two of them fell in a strange silence. Gojo could feel that she was thinking about how to retell her story and as such did not urge her. How long ago was it? Yeah, I remember. It was about 2,500 years ago. Back then, I was born as the result of the union between a servant and the lord of a minor noble family. A bastard child like many others. Hana let out a chuckle as she shook her head. Back then, the Shiba family was still one of the great five families, and my family, while far weaker than the big five, was still quite renowned, mainly thanks to our sword art. A look of reminiscence flashed in her eyes. Those times were the most boring years of my life. The disgust in her voice completely took Gojo aback. Every day was the same. I would be trained to be the perfect young lady. I would learn the 7 arts and how to become the perfect vase for my future husband. I was neither despised nor respected. The other servants always kept a healthy distance from me. Of course, my mother died not long after my birth. Hana remembered those days with bitterness and boredom. Those days were quite painful for her. All that changed one day when I was proposed to in a marriage. A laugh escaped her. It was some crazy bastard. A man with disgusting hobbies. He had more than 25 concubines, but not one of them survived more than 2 years after marrying him. Having caught his interest was clearly a death sentence for me. Despite this, my father was so happy it seemed like he would burst. After all, an union with such a powerful family would elevate his standing. I remember his words quite clearly. Dear daughter, we need to sacrifice you for the family. It was then I understood, or rather, I had always understood, but I was just refusing to see the truth. In the eyes of that father of mine, I was just the daughter of a maid. A sacrificial pawn ready to be discarded at any moment. That's why, on that day, I smiled and said, of course, father. I will not disappoint you. From that day on, she would follow her classes during the day, but during the night she would train as much as possible without getting caught. Even back then, her talent for the sword had already begun to bloom. At the same time, she began to read books about the outside, about survival, and basically other such books to increase her knowledge. She also began to hide money and food that could be conserved for a long time. 1 year later, on the night of my wedding, I used the short lapse when my so-called husband was taking off his clothes to consummate our marriage and I stabbed him in the neck. Again and again, until I was sure he was dead. Despite his faults, the man had been quite the warrior. Hana knew perfectly well that her chances in a direct clash were rather small, and as such, she went for a sneak attack. After all, who would suspect the gentle and helpless young lady of a noble family to prepare an assassination? They say that the first time someone is killed, they would feel an incredible discomfort at the fact. Some even vomited or got traumatized. Hana did not feel any of that. The only thing she thought at that time while feeling the warm blood splash on her face and watching the light slowly fade from the eyes of her dying husband was, how beautiful. After this, using the cover of the night, I entered the guest room my father was using. He was completely drunk, clearly happy about selling his daughter even though it would mean her death. So I killed him. Then, I fled to Rukongai and was then branded as a criminal. It must have been quite hard. Hey, what do you think? A pampered little princess who knew nothing of the world entering the Rukongai during the most chaotic era. Even though my head was filled with theoretical knowledge, the simple fact that I survived my earlier years was a miracle. Did you regret your choice? Gojo asked, genuinely curious. Never. I mean, don't you find it ridiculous? One man caused the death of 25 people and most likely much more, but he could strut around without any problems. Meanwhile, just because I fought back, I was branded as a criminal. So in their opinion, I should have simply let myself get killed. So, I have never regretted it, it was me or them. I choose to save myself. A blush covered her face, clearly, even though the alcohol content was quite low, it was still getting to her head. Despite this, she filled her glass and took another swing. Since that day, I have constantly been on the run. Chased by the two families and a few bounty hunters. I killed, again and again, day after day, year after year. Not only did I not die, but I slowly became stronger. The previously tough fights became easier and easier until one day, I understood. Ah, I am strong. I decided I was done being chased around, and so, I came back and killed all the higher-ups of the two families. She gave a faint smile. On that day, I gave up my name and named myself Yakiru Unohana. It was also on that day that I became known as the most diabolical criminal to ever exist in the Soul Society. From then on, people did not chase her, it was her chasing after people. She stopped killing in self-defense, but simply enjoyed the thrill of fighting, the feelings of dancing at the precipice between life and death. It was during those days that Yamamoto invited me to become a founding member of the Gote 13. Gojo looked at the side profile of Unohana. With her white clothes and pale complexion, she seemed to shine under the moonlight. How did one of the greatest criminals become a member of the army? It was simple. He said, "Follow me and you will fight against the strongest beings in the world." How could I refuse such a proposal? Looking at the beautiful smile that lit up her face at the mention of fighting strong people, Gojo gave a faint smile while wondering how someone could look so hot while acting like a crazy psycho. Chapter 75. Darling. After Unohana poured her heart to him and told him her story, Gojo sat pensively while holding the cup full of red wine. I wonder if she likes drinking wine because it looks like blood. Musing about this weirdly realistic possibility, Gojo chuckled inwardly a little. Even though the two of them were silent, the atmosphere did not feel awkward in the least. Rather, it was a warm and calm silence that peacefully embraced the two of them. The fact was that in those short 5 years, Unohana became the one person he trusted the most aside from his own sword. She was a mentor and a friend. Someone he knew he could leave 99% of his back to. There was always that 1% chance she would go all crazy on him and try to fight him to the death. Even so, it was rare for the two of them to share such a moment. Why did you suddenly share your story? The reason. Unohana gave a mysterious smile. Well, let's just say that I wanted someone to listen to me. Gojo stilled before understanding dawned upon him. Throwing him a look, Unohana kept her smile as she said, "It seems like you understood." Of course. Very well then. Standing and taking her sword with her, Unohana begins to walk away after leaving those words, "The day you become captain officially is the day the two of us will fight for one last time." Becoming a captain? Huh. The place he was gunning for was the post of captain of the 3rd Division. The current captain was an old woman named Shikane Iba. From what Gojo knew, she was also the mother of Tetsuziman, the vice-captain of the 7th Division. The reason why the current captain of the 3rd Division wished to step down was that she was never really fit to be captain in the first place. 60 years ago, the captain of the 3rd Division was a man named Rojiro Odoribashi. He was one of the fugitives that had followed Kazuki Urahara and Yoruichi Shihoin. Even to this day, Gojo did not really know why so many captains and vice captains had suddenly become fugitives and what they were accused of. It seemed to be some rather high-ranked secret. Though it didn't matter currently. What mattered was that after the position of captain became empty, Chikane Iba had been chosen to take over the position of captain until a more suitable candidate was chosen. Until 5 years ago that candidate had been Jin Ichimaru, but his arrival had changed everything. Did Gojo feel bad about the fact that he might soon snatch the position from someone else? Not at all. It wasn't as if he and that Jin guy knew each other. Even though he seemed to be the childhood friend of Rangaku and a sort of brother figure for her, it wasn't something he had to care about. So, we will fight in about 5 years. Gojo understood very well that this last fight wouldn't just be their regular training session. On that day, if he lost, she would cut him down without the slightest pity. If he won though, a grin formed on his face. Seems like I need to up my training. As he was now, he was sure that he could fight against most captains without any problem. Even though winning might be difficult, it wasn't impossible. But Hana was a different breed. Standing up, he stretched calmly, before letting his shadow swallow him. 3 days later, Gojo was standing in front of a very large compound. The mansion of the Kuchiki family. From what he could see, the width of the plot of land belonging to the Kuchiki was already equal to that of a small city. Even though it was his first time visiting, Gojo wasn't surprised by the opulence. The Kuchiki were filthy rich. For example, the scarf that Byakuya always wore was made out of the silk of the silver-white wildflower. An extremely rare species. In terms of monetary worth, that scarf alone was the equivalent of 10 mansions in the Seraiti. Is it really alright for me to follow you? Gojo waved his hand dismissively. It doesn't matter. Your creator will find a way to explain the current situation if necessary. Understood. Nemu nodded obediently and stood straighter. At a nobleman at. Gojo eyed her. He had given her many opportunities during those 3 days to flee, but she seemed content to stay beside him. Even though he had all but kidnapped her, the girl seemed to be content to stay by his side and observe him. It was really too weird, but he didn't care. Why would he mind having a sexy woman staying around him? Since she had behaved, he decided to take her for a stroll. Man, that sounded so wrong. Once they were in front of the wide gate, Gojo knocked gently. Hello, is there someone? He hadn't tried to hide all the way in, so he should have already been noticed. But Gojo didn't mind being polite. The moment he did so, 4 ninjas wearing purple clothes appeared in front of him. Those guys were the equivalent of the Fawn family belonging to the Kuchiki family. Though they were certainly way weaker than the Fawn, they were still useful guards in Gojo's opinion, or meat shields and sacrifice. After all, if anyone who could threaten Byakuya entered the house, those guys would only be useful to stall for time. Welcome, SATORU Gojo. The head is expecting you. One of the purple ninjas talked with a calm voice. Then, turning his attention toward Nemu, he tilted his head in confusion. He was most likely wondering what the second in command of the 12th Division was doing with him but didn't bother asking. As for Miss Kuratsuchi, she will be led away by the young miss. I see. Hey, Nemu. Yes, I want you to follow Rukia when she comes. Don't kick a fuss. I understand. Nemu bowed again simply and walked to the side before waiting. Gojo threw her a look before shrugging. Now wasn't the time to think about her. Rather he needed to find a way to convince Byakuya. That's why the moment he saw Byakuya and Rukia walking toward them, Gojo chuckled and began to run toward him with his arms wide open. Byakuya darling. Come give me a hug. Chapter 76. Useful Misunderstanding. Seraiti, Kuchiki family. Haha. Byakuya. Stop pulling such a long face. It was just a prank, nothing more. Sitting face to face on a tatami in a tea room, Gojo laughed boisterously while trying to calm down Byakuya Kuchiki. While I believe that everyone has the right to love whoever they want, I do not appreciate jokes that put my sexuality in question. Hey, isn't it just because you don't want to look uncool in front of your sister? Byakuya did not answer. There were many bad rumors about Byakuya and Rukia. The main reason for that was the fact that Rukia simply looked too much like the deceased wife of Byakuya. Because of it, some people thought that rather than a sister, Rukia was a surrogate wife for Byakuya and even warmed his bed. But Gojo understood clearly. This man bore no romantic feelings toward Rukia. He was just a devoted brother who wished to take care of his adoptive sister, though an awkward and clumsy older brother with a stiff face that did not know how to properly express his feelings. Currently, the two of them were in one of the training rooms of the compound. On the wall, He could see quite the number of swords, each clearly of high quality. After his little stunt earlier, Gojo nearly died of laughter as he watched the expressions of the two siblings. Now though, sadly, wasn't the time to think of the past. Rather, it was time to think of the future. After Gojo explained his plan, Byakuya pondered a little. So you wish to develop the entertainment industry, and for this, you need our help. Exactly. I don't really need monetary help. I mainly need your relay stations and your backing for some operations. What kind of entertainment do you have in mind exactly? More importantly, why should we help you? Gojo wasn't surprised by the question. The two of them had a certain respect for each other and they recognized their strengths, but that was all. Of course, Gojo could call in the debt Byakuya owed him since he saved Rukia, but doing so would be far too short-sighted. It wasn't easy to get the head of such a powerful family indebted to you. He had to be careful with that. And this was where it became tricky. What did the Kuchiki family lack? Money. Their clothes were worth houses. Influence. They were the first family. Power. Both Byakuya and his grandfather were powerhouses. For your first question, aside from that magazine called SATORU Communication. You guys really lack a way to entertain. The SATORU Communication was a magazine created nearly 1,000 years ago that was pretty cheap. The one in charge of publicizing that magazine was the 9th Division, currently under Konami Tosen. A blind bastard who seemed to have a bone to pick with him. That guy had some weird sense of justice and did not seem like a bad guy, but Gojo hated dealing with the man. He hated that sanctimonious act of his and all the jazz that came with it. Of course, the guy didn't simply have something against him. It seemed that he also hated Zaraki very much and had been one of the few to vehemently object when Zaraki had been named as captain. Currently, Shuhei was working as the 10th seat of that division. The two of them sometimes met each other, but Gojo had nothing to say to the man. So they never spoke to each other. Byakuya brought him back from his random thoughts. The magazine is indeed the only way of entertainment. Captain Yamamoto initiated it over 1,000 years ago and had the goal to keep the Shinigami informed of what was happening while raising morale during times of war and increasing solidarity. Hey, what a nice way to describe propaganda. Even so, Gojo understood what Byakuya meant. The SATORU was massive and each division was pretty much isolated from each other. Captains could spend years without meeting. Plus, events that needed all captains to meet were pretty rare. This was even more so for people on lower levels. Even missions were done by teams from the same division most of the time. The only divisions that had regular contact with all the other ones were the 2nd, 4th, and 12th divisions, for obvious reasons. So you see, we could work with the 9th division and create a special magazine. The problem is their captain, he pretty much hates me. So I would need your influence. Currently, some of the captains would write short novels or such from time to time in the magazine. Some were popular while others were not. Drawings, music, films and so on. There are so many things you can do. The technology of the Soul Society was more than developed enough. Bringing things such as TV would be so easy. As to what it can bring you, wouldn't it be beautiful if you could lower the poverty rate in Rukongai? Byakuya's expression shifted, clearly becoming much more interested. Explain. Gojo smiled. The main problem with the Soul Society is that the prerequisite to enter the Shinigami Academy or obtain money is to have enough spiritual power. Basically, the military and nobility are the most important. But 90% of the souls cannot develop a great amount of Raryoku, and out of those remaining another 90% are too weak to enter the academy. Only the elite could enter the academy and only the elite out of those elites could become seated officers. But what if you guys developed an industry where having power is unnecessary? An industry that could help those with power to have more distraction and lower their stress levels. At Novelban at. You didn't need to have the power to dance or draw or so. If those industries were developed, the poor would become slightly less poor. Of course, even then, people would need to have a certain amount of talent and it would take time and money to form them. But the result would without a doubt be worth it. Byakuya stayed silent for a short while before looking at Gojo with complicated eyes. Ever since he had married Hasana, he had always been interested in helping the civilians living in the Rukongai. But no matter how rich the Kuchiki family was, there was a limit to what it could do alone. What's more, as a traditional man, he had been in the mindset of needing power to leave the Rukongai and becoming useful. But the man in front of him, one who came from the Rukongai, seemed to be really worried about the well-being of his compatriots and thought so much to help them. He did not even ask to get money and only wished to help them out of pure goodwill. What an admirable man. If until now Byakuya had only respected the power of the man, now he came to respect his character as a person. Satoru Gojo, you are really a man worthy of respect. The Soul Society needs a captain like you. I promise to vote for you later. With a grave expression, Byakuya solemnly swore, leaving a bewildered Gojo. Did he perhaps have a misunderstanding? If it was a game, he felt like he would have seen Byakuya affection points shoot through the roof. If Gojo could read Byakuya's thoughts, he would have exploded with laughter. After all, he couldn't really care less about what happened to the people of Rukongai. Of course, he wasn't a cold bastard and didn't mind helping people. But he would never cogitate entire nights just for that. Satoru Gojo was a selfish man at heart and he still did not really identify himself with the Soul Society. How could he? After all, he knew that he should be ready to bolt out at any moment should the Gote 13 or the Central 46 get a whiff of what his true research was about. Still, even though he didn't understand what happened, he was smart enough to not miss the opportunity that was presented to him. He decided against mentioning that he wished to take a look at the history and simply gave a faint smile. Yeah, let's use that favorable opinion of his and slowly develop some deep friendship first. Chapter 77. Beautiful Coincidences. After the weird misunderstanding Byakuya had on him, the discussion flowed far more smoothly and they debated on most of the details. Of course, Gojo was no specialist, so it would take time to truly study everything and create a viable plan, but this wasn't something that concerned him. What's more, Gojo had proposed that they begin a test with members of the Gote 13 who had basically no fighting potential as a test. For example, those who had written that BL idea. Even though Byakuya had been quite reticent, Gojo insisted. As always, messing with someone as straight-laced as Byakuya was quite fun. The reason Gojo wished for the initial plan to concern the Gote 13 was for the simple reason that if it affected the whole Seraiti, then they would need the permission of the Central 46, and Gojo could already imagine the result. Politics in his old world were slow, and that was despite the fact that the politicians didn't live hundreds of years. Because of their large lifespans, the politics in the Seraiti was a monstrous pain in the ass. A bunch of hundreds of years old traditionalist bastards who refused to see any changes. The only difference between them and the old bastards in his world was that those bastards were far older. Back when he was still alive, after killing Suguru with his own hands, Gojo began fighting for a better future for the next generation. Of course, he could have simply killed all the higher-ups and be done with it, but this would not have helped in accomplishing his goal. Though it would have made him very happy. He did not wish to become a dictator. Rather, he wished for a truly fundamental change and this was why he had begun developing a new generation of sorcerers with a totally different mindset. Thankfully, he was pretty sure that even though he died, with Yuta, Yuji, and Megumi as the helm of the new generation, his endeavor did not go to waste. Now that he was dead though, he would simply live for himself as he did before killing his friend. As such, he had no qualms about resorting to violence should the Central 46 ever try to provoke him. As long as they don't mess with me, I won't mess with them. Pardon. Haha. Sorry, I was just talking to myself. Currently, Gojo was walking in the West Rukongai with Nemu following one step behind him. Once he had finished discussing with Byakuya, Gojo simply stood up and left. He could develop his relationship with Byakuya later and become closer to him. From the start, getting the archives from the Kuchiki family had only been a secondary goal. But obtaining Byakuya's support had been quite unexpected. There were 3 ways to become captain in the Seraiti. The first one was the proficiency test. Basically, the one wishing to become captain had to show his Bankai under the witness of the captain commander and 2 other captains. The second one was to have the recommendation of at least 6 captains, then the approval of at least 3 of the remaining 7. The final one was to defeat the captain in 1 versus 1 combat under the witness of at least 200 members of the division. Death was not necessary in principle. Even though Gojo had more or less reached Bankai and would perfect his mastery of it by the end of the remaining 5 years, he was extremely reluctant about showing it. After all, it was quite dangerous. Gojo had been rather shocked by what he could do in theory and did not even dare to activate it near the Seraiti. That was why he had initially decided that he would let Jin become captain, then he would propose a duel and defeat him openly. Quite insidious. But who cared? But, now that he thought about it, using the second way would be far more helpful. He had the support of Unohana, and now the same went for Byakuya. He knew that Zaraki and Shunsui would support him should he ask. The same went for Soifan and he could use the debt Yukitaki owed him. Unknowingly, He had already fulfilled the first step and gathered the 6 necessary recommendations in the bag. As for the remaining 3 votes, he was sure that he could get Mayuri's vote with some little convincing. This left Yamamoto, the current captain of the 3rd Division, Sosuke Aizen, the blind bastard, the hidden face bastard, and the captain of the 10th Division Isshin Shiba. What was beautiful was that his little bro, Toshiro Hitsugaya, was in the 1st Division, and not only was he friends with Rangaku, he also saved Miyako Shiba from nearly certain death. What beautiful coincidences. It was as if all the steps were placed for him to become captain without exerting the slightest energy. Since he was in a jovial mood, he decided to discuss a little with Nemu. So, how was your day with Rukia? It was enjoyable. The nearly emotionless way she answered would have made it seem like she was lying, but Gojo's eyes could catch the subtle change of expression on her face. It seemed that she still had problems expressing her feelings, but from her circumstances, it was pretty normal. Did you make any friends? Friends. If by friend you mean a close confidant to whom I can share my worries and have a good time with, I did not. I see. Dealing with her wouldn't be easy. Dealing with anyone who suffered from abuse for as long they could remember was never easy. Back then, taking care of Megumi had been quite a pain. Even more so since he had only been a high school student himself. He had to threaten the Zenin clan and bargain with the higher-ups. It didn't help that Megumi himself wasn't really cute. He was pretty sure that Nemu had it way worse than Megumi. Her heart was already nearly closed. Normally, he wouldn't care about her. But since he kind of kidnapped her, he had her live in his hideout for 3 days, and kind of got attached. The fact that she was technically something, or rather someone that should not exist, also kinda piqued his interests, not to mention she had quite the sexy body that appealed to him plenty. Gojo's power over spiritual matters meant that he could recreate an entire body as long as he had enough understanding about the constitution of said body. Until now, all he could create were shell bodies. His understanding of anatomy and biology were too lacking to allow him to recreate entire bodies out of just reishi. One of the reasons he was quite intrigued with Nemu was the existence of her soul more than her body. If Gojo could recreate souls, then as long as he mastered the creation of the body, he could truly call himself a god of life. At the very least, he knew that as long as he furthered his mastery over his Shikai, he would be near omnipotent in the Soul Society and Hueco Mundo. So, what do you think of becoming my friend? Turning around, he smiled at the sight of the stunned expression on Nemu's face. Then, ruffling her hair, well, take your time to think about it. Nemu was left to her own thoughts as she watched the back of Gojo. Like this, the two continued to walk in silence until they finally reached their destination. Once they did, the two of them opened their eyes wide at the sight of the house in front of them. Gojo tilted his head and caressed his chin. Well, the architect of this house has quite the peculiar taste. What's more, not only could he feel Rangaku's Reiatsu, he could also feel 2 other deep and heavy ones. Clearly belonging to Yukataki and Isshin. It seemed that this day promised to be quite interesting. Chapter 78. Shiba 1. Welcome. Gojo-san, how have you been? And this is. When Gojo finally reached the doorsteps of the Shiba house, he was received by a smiling Miyako. Hello. Well, everything has been pretty alright. The young beauty behind me is Nemu, vice captain of the 12th Division. Miyako of course knew who Nemu was. Even though most divisions were pretty closed off, all divisions needed the help of the 12th Division. So the higher-ups were pretty well known. She briefly wondered what the 3rd seat of the 4th Division and the 2nd seat of the 12th were doing together, before discarding the thought. It was not her problem and she was not the kind who liked to snoop in the private life of others. And with Gojo's reputation as a skirt chaser, it was pretty easy to imagine the relationship between the two. Coming to a conclusion, she smiled and bowed. Welcome, Nimari Kuretsuchi. I am Miyako Shiba. We are glad to have you. Hello. Nemu responded by giving a simple bow. Miyako was not particularly surprised, she already knew about Nemu's personality. Sue, before we enter, could you tell me who designed this house? Miyako blushed. The current house was rather large, clearly showing that even though the Shiba were a somewhat fallen house, they weren't completely poor either. The problem was most of the decorations, like 2 muscled arms on either side of the door or the crab-like sculptures on the roof. Coughing a little, she gave a strained smile as she answered, do not mind the decorations, please. My sister-in-law just likes playing pranks sometimes. She could not really say that her sister-in-law had a weird fashion sense. Hey, well, shall we enter? Everyone is waiting for us. Deciding to not call out such a pitiful attempt at switching topics, Gojo simply nodded. Lead the way. Dash dash dash. After entering the house, they were led toward a rather large room with a long low table placed in the middle and large cushions to serve the purpose of chairs. The table was already filled with food still hot fresh out of the oven. Finally, the star of the day is here. Man, I was starving. Seated on the head of the table was a tall black-haired man who looked similar to Kyan. He was wearing the standard uniform of the Shinigami and a white coat. He was Isshin Shiba, the captain of the 10th Division. Good afternoon, SATORU Gojo. Next to him was a silver-haired man wearing the same uniform, Jashiro Yukitaki. At Nobleman at. Ha ha ha, sorry for being late. I had to visit Byakuya Kuchiki to propose a little project of mine. Waving his hand, he swept the room with a look. Aside from Isshin and Jashiro, he could also see Kyan and Rangaku. He knew that Kyan had two other siblings, but since he saw no one else, it seemed that this was a Shinigami gathering only, or perhaps they were just busy. Hey Tilda, handsome guy, come take a seat. Smiling at Rangaku, he nudged Nemu to follow him before sitting on the right of Rangaku. Lowering his glasses, he asked, Hey, sexy girl, how are my babies? The direction his gaze settled on was pretty clear. As always, the front of her kimono was half open, showing a ridiculous amount of cleavage. Any other woman would have been rather incensed at such rude remarks. But Rangaku simply chortled and raised her chest with dissatisfaction. Firstly, they aren't yours, and secondly, they are doing all right. Although you wouldn't believe how much of a pain it is to have them. Oh, you nearly choked again. Yeah, like, I was super drunk and I made the mistake of falling asleep on my stomach. Imagine dying from asphyxia because of a pair of boobs. Honestly, it's like one of the top ways I wish to die. The two of them immediately began to joke around while throwing around sexual innuendos. Watching from the side, the other participant seemed a little surprised. Are they always like this? Kyan asked Isshin. Isshin smiled. Well, pretty much, should I say. Those two are really friendly with each other. I even wondered why it never went farther. From what I know, he isn't shy about relationships. Jashiro shrugged. I heard even Shunsui's vice captain had a pretty ambiguous relationship with him. It seems like he simply avoids any relationship that might be too serious. Jashiro was a good man, but he wasn't a naive one. He wouldn't give his trust to someone like Gojo if he hadn't at least done some research beforehand. This was why he found the man to be extremely intriguing. In Jashiro's eyes, SATORU Gojo was an enigma more than anything. He sometimes acted frivolous and lustful, but at the same time, he seemed to be a caring man with his own code. He had tried to see if the man was just a scumbag that used and threw away women after getting what he wished for, but surprisingly, despite his playboy attitude, the women he had partnered with had nothing bad to say about him. The same went for his work ethics. He could clearly see in his way of acting and speaking that Gojo Satoru was the kind of man who could watch the world burn and laugh at it. He would give his all to save and protect his teammates, but he would feel no sadness should said teammates die far away from his eyes. In fact, it seemed that sometimes Gojo did not even bother remembering the name of those he did find interesting. This duality of his personality made him both a pretty interesting person, and an extremely dangerous man. But more than anything, those eyes of his. He did not know what the world looked like through the eyes of this enigmatic Shinigami. But there was one thing he was sure of, and that was that this man could see his greatest secret. The fact that Mimihagi, the right hand of the Soul King, inhabited his lungs. Seraiti, 2nd Division. Right now, in the main office of the 2nd Division, Soi Fan was reading an identification card in front of her with a frown on her face. Looking at the somewhat haughty man standing in front of her, she asked. So, what exactly does Central 46 want from the 2nd Division? The man, tall and black-haired, and wearing a luxurious kimono, fanned himself as he laughed. This is where you are wrong. We are not asking for the 2nd Division. But rather, the secret force. Her eyes narrowed at the way he was talking, but since she represented both the Shihoin and the Fan family, she did not wish to affect the reputation of the families because of her impulsiveness. What do you wish from us? Simple. It seems that recently, an exiled noble family is acting in a rather fishy way. We caught traces of them in the Dongai, something that should be impossible. This is why Central 46 has decided to request their complete and absolute eradication. I see. Soi Fan closed her eyes, as she asked, the Dongai is a very dangerous place and would require much man-force to keep inactive in order to avoid the sweeper. Such a mission is extremely dangerous. Too much for the secret force alone. That is of course. We have decided to name you as the leader of the operation. You will be accompanied by members of the 4th and 12th divisions of your choice. The Kido Corps will also send some of their members. What do you think? She nodded. With such a deal, she did not have many reasons to refuse. So, which exiled family is the target? One that was exiled nearly 1,000 years ago, the fallen Ryodoji family. Chapter 79. Shiba 2. So, how exactly did we get here? Currently, the sun hung high in the sky while two Shinigami faced each other. Ha ha ha. Don't mind the small details. I just thought that since you want to become captain, I need to at least ascertain your skills, right? Even though the two of them were talking nonchalantly, a subtle feeling of tension could be felt gradually growing between them. Hey, is that so? Don't complain if everything in this zone gets razed to the ground. Gojo shrugged and warned Isshin lightly. It wasn't like this place was close to his home. So he did not really care what happened to it. Nah, don't worry. I just want a simple exchange of blows. You see, I think that the best way to understand someone is through the way they fight. Isshin calmly dismissed those worries. He understood how destructive fights at their level could be. Erasing an entire city wouldn't even be that complicated, and that would just be the collateral damage. Quote. I see. You must think I am a meathead, right? Not really. The personality of a warrior is indeed reflected in the way he fights. Well then, how about this? Only Shikai and no Kido above 30. Of course, in the hands of a captain, even a low-level Kido could show tremendous might, but once again, this wasn't his home. But for Isshin, something else in this sentence caught his attention. He widened his eyes at the implications of the words uttered by Gojo. You already reached that level? You awakened your Bankai. This would change many things. Hee. Let's say it's my little secret. Well then, shall we begin? Gojo didn't wish for it to be known that he reached the Bankai. Because technically, he didn't. At the very least, he refused to say that he had reached a level when he was still unable to properly and perfectly control it. A little farther, about 5 kilometers away, Rangaku observed the two Shinigami with Nemu standing next to her. She couldn't help but smile wryly as she remembered how this situation came to be. The party had been quite successful. Even though some of them had been awkward at first, they rapidly warmed to each other and joked together. Even Nemu, though she stayed silent until the end, could be seen trying to smile from time to time. But like all good things, the end was slowly coming. Shinigami were generally not rowdy. At least as long as they were not doing something that particularly interested them, they could even be quite lethargic. This was what happened when you lived hundreds of years in the same place, seeing the same people every day. People like Zaraki were no exception since aside from fighting, he would sleep most of the time. But just as they were about to put an end and separate, Isshin had suddenly asked Gojo if the rumors about him wishing to become captain were true. Once Gojo answered in affirmation, Isshin expressed that he was willing to support and give his vote to Gojo since he did not particularly like Jin. Even though Rangaku liked Gojo, Jin was also her childhood friend. So she had been quite bitter. Even so, she understood where her captain was coming from and could not blame him. Jin was simply too secretive. Even her, as his one and only friend, could not say that she really understood him. Much less strangers who knew nothing of him. Shaking her head, she looked at the woman next to her. Who do you think will win? Nemu on the other hand tilted her head slightly before answering calmly, at Novelban at. I believe that SATORU Gojo is stronger. Oh, you seem to have quite the trust in him. It was rather surprising. After all, no matter how popular Gojo was, the difference between a captain and anyone else at a lower rank was quite wide. It was even more so for people like Isshin who could be considered to be one of the top-level captains. Inwardly, she also wondered what kind of relationship Nemu had with Gojo. Nemu Kuretsuchi was truly an enigma for the other vice-captains. They did not know where she came from and no one had ever seen her use her Zanpakuto. What's more, she was pretty recluse and did not mingle with the others. Rangaku had always wished to talk to her because of the melancholy she could see on her face. So she had been pretty surprised when she saw Nemu with Gojo. She had been friends with Gojo for 5 years, and though she couldn't say that she knew him very well, she knew that he did not like women with heavy baggage. He never connected too deeply with anyone and always kept a wall tightly around his heart. Even if he could be seen laughing or joking around, you could never really understand what he was thinking. Sometimes she even wondered if he could feel anything at all. Well, let's see the fight. They weren't the only ones observing the fight. Both Kyan and Captain Yukitaki were also observing the situation, though they were far closer. As for Miyako, she had opted to stay and take care of the house. As for her curiosity about his relationship with Nemu, she could simply ask him later. Back to Gojo, he smiled and asked. Let me be clear. If we get punished later, I will put all the blame on you. Ishin laughed loudly as he unheated his sword. No worries. Only fights between captains or vice captains are forbidden. Officially, you are neither, at least for now. Now then, shall we go? Very well. Through heaven and earth, we alone are the honored ones, Tengoku no Kogo. Ha ha ha. This is it. Laughing, he shouted at the top of his lungs, burn. Engetsu. 1 Engetsu equals scathing moon. Chapter 80. Shiba 3. Very well. Through heaven and earth, we alone are the honored ones, Tengoku no Kogo. Ha ha ha. This is it. Laughing, he shouted at the top of his lungs, burn. Engetsu. The moment the two of them uttered their activation's words, the world seemed to be separated in two. On one side, a holy light lit up the surroundings brightly. At the same time, large white wings grew and spread behind Gojo, along with a regal crown of pure holy light constructing above his head. His entire being seemed to exude a sacred aura. Meanwhile, the sword in his hand elongated and took the form of a long katana with a black and white patterned guard before scattering in tiny specks of light that fused with his wings. His bright blue eyes containing the depth of the ocean were bare for the world to see, the black sunglasses already discarded. Anyone that looked into his glowing eyes would feel their souls drowning in an endless abyss. On the other side, the world seemed to be set ablaze with the continuously rising temperature. Ishin himself did not change, and neither did his sword. The only difference was the blazing flames that now surrounded it. Oddly, it looked as though a devil from hell was facing a messenger of heaven. Both Gojo and Ishin clashed through their Reiatsu. It was to such levels that even Rangaku and Nemu, who stood a few kilometers away, felt breathless under their immense pressure. In fact, since none of them placed a barrier, the clash of their Reiatsu could already be felt in the garrison next to the west gate. So, elemental powers run in the family, I guess. Gojo joked nonchalantly. He didn't really care if people could feel him or not. All he needed to show an appropriate level of power. Meanwhile, both Ishin and Jashiro, who stood a little farther, had their expressions harden. They had difficulty believing it at first, but now, there was no doubt. Gojo was really in no way inferior to a captain. In fact, his presence did not seem to lose even against veteran captains like Ishin. So this is what he really looks like when he is a little serious. Jashiro muttered to himself. He had read the report of Miyako and Rukia and clearly, there was no depiction of those wings. From all the research he did, Gojo only used those wings briefly while fighting some Mainos on Earth. Though it seemed that back then, the wings were far dimmer. So the power of his Shikai depends on the concentration of Reishi in the atmosphere. This was an important point to note. Clearly, this man was at his most powerful when he fought in the Soul Society or the Hawako Mundo. Minus the wings and crown, I really feel like I am fighting against a Quincy. Ishin muttered while tightening his grip on his sword. Clearly, he had come to the same conclusion as Jashiro. At Nobleman at. It was then that he shook his head and less than Shunpo greater than. Sidestepped at the speed of sound, thereby avoiding 4 chains that had appeared out of nowhere to bind him. He did not know whether those chains could really keep him imprisoned, but in a high-speed battle, losing one's own mobility was fatal. Smiling, he proceeded to use another Shunpo, one far faster than the previous one, and reached Gojo in the blink of an eye, before swinging his sword with all his might. Even though he did not use any technique, the air seemed to tear apart as the force of the swing and the high temperature distorted the atmosphere. Clearly, should anyone below the level of captain take such a blow head-on, they would have a hard time waking up again. But, slow. Thanks to the 6 eyes, the world Gojo saw was distinctively different from what others could see. From his perspective, even though Ishin was moving at a speed far surpassing that of the sound, it was in reality no different than simply walking towards him. In this world where everything moved too slow for his taste, Gojo raised his hand, which was covered in blood vein, and slapped away the fire-encased sword, resulting in everything in that direction being reduced to ash. Then, using the same hand, he clenched his fist before proceeding to enter the guard of Ishin and throwing a punch. Boom. TCH, it got blocked. Gojo clicked his tongue. Even though the shock wave created by his fists had created craters behind Ishin, he saw Ishin manage to block the hit by using his free hand and disperse the force without taking the slightest damage. From his peripheral vision, he could also see the sword of fire coming with vengeance at his midsection. Clearly, Ishin thought that he had Gojo trapped. Unfortunately for him, you should escape. Hearing this warning, Ishin felt all the hair on his body stand up, while a strange sense of unease filled him. Listening to his instinct, even though it slightly hurt his arm, he immediately dispelled his attack, and hurriedly retreated hundreds of meters away with consecutive shunpos. No sooner did he do so. Boom. The place where he previously stood was covered by a veritable rain of light. The rain of light fell with the might of meteors, giving rise to a cloud of dust. Once the dust was swept away, Ishin murmured with surprise. Oh, what a scary kid. Everything within a few meter radius around Gojo had been razed to the ground. Raising his head, Ishin was awestruck at the sight above Gojo. Starry sky. A little cheesy, I know. But that's what I call it. Would have been even more beautiful at night. Ishin could only agree. After all, high above the head of Gojo, tens of glowing lances made out of light could be seen everywhere. Ishin let out a strained laugh. He knew that Gojo's Shikai could only control Reishi in a very limited zone. Between 5 to 10 meters from what his instincts were telling him. In a way, such a small zone seemed laughable, to the point of even being negligible. After all, fights between powerful Shinigami affected kilometers around them. What was a measly 10 meters when some captains could summon techniques that could affect hundreds of meters or the whole Soul Society? But now that he saw this, he understood. Those 10 meters were indeed negligible. But at the same time, they represented an absolute zone that could not be trespassed lightly. Ha 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 ha. Beautiful. You indeed stumped me. But if that's all, then I just have to not come close. He changed his one-handed grip to a two-handed one and slowly raised his sword above his head, a fierce grin splitting his face. Your sword represents heaven, right? Hey, then take this gift of mine. Whoosh. The fire roared, while the Reiatsu of Ishin rose to an incredible level. Finally, after uttering 2 words, he swung his sword with all his might. Those words were, Getsuga Tensho. 1. The world was instantly dyed white. 1. Moon Fang Piercer of the Heaven. Chapter 81. Explosion. Getsuga Tensho. A curtain of light and fire was drawn as what looked like fangs of destruction destroyed everything in their wake. Observing the fight from far away, Rangaku once again ascertained why captains were forbidden from fighting against each other. Thankfully, Shinigami were different from hollows in that most of their attacks were extremely concentrated in order to deal the maximum damage possible. Because of this, even when an attack that should have been enough to destroy an entire city was launched, it would only destroy a smaller zone. After all, while destroying your surroundings sounded and looked quite cool, it was a waste of power that could have been used to target your enemy. Even so, the fight she was witnessing was a sight to behold. She could clearly feel that the two were holding back, talking leisurely and exchanging blows. But even that was enough to kill someone at her level 10 times over. So he has already reached such a level. Rangaku clenched her fists unconsciously, first Jin and now Gojo. It seemed that she was destined to be surpassed by the men she cared for, and this frustrated her so much. Even though she felt that she had room to grow, she also felt like she had hit a wall. It was a very contradictory feeling. It was as if she should have been something much more, but was missing a piece of the whole that formed her. Perhaps I should ask Gojo later. She knew that his eyes allowed him to see things differently from other people. Perhaps he could give her the solution. It was worth trying at least, she had nothing to lose after all. While Rangaku was introspecting, Ishin was looking at the results of his attack with shock in his eyes. He wasn't surprised at the destruction. The Getsuga Tensho was a technique he had created while taking inspiration from the Sero of the Manos. As such, the technique really wasted power uselessly, and even though it was flashy, the amount of damage it could bring to an enemy was limited. Even so, to think he took this head on. Even though he was quite far, he could clearly see Gojo after all the dust dispersed. Currently, Gojo's Shinigami uniform was nearly completely scrapped and was reduced to rags. But even though he was showing such a sorry sight, there was one thing to note. Not even a wound. This was unbelievable. From what he could see, Gojo's entire body seemed to be covered in blue lines. Clearly, he had covered his body in blood veins and tanked the attack. Even though he did not go all out, and Getsuga Tensho was still not complete as a technique, this was still incredible. Gojo meanwhile, wasn't feeling great. Moving his stiff shoulder, he grumbled like an old grandpa. Man, My joints are killing me. He should not have been so reckless as to take on such an attack with his body. But it was a necessary experiment. An occasion he could not miss. After all, he would soon face Unohana in a death match. Her Bankai, Minazuki, was no joke. If his body wasn't strong enough, he would melt like goo before even being able to inflict the slightest wound on her. That's why he took the risk, and he did not regret it, since he had indeed found his limits. I lost my arms and a few organs. Even though he looked unscathed right now, it hadn't really been the case. Despite using blood veins at maximum output, his body was still shredded. But thanks to his reishi manipulation, he could heal himself as much as he wished. You really are a cheat. Your words are music to my ears. You finally recognize that I am better than that limitless of yours. Gojo laughed lightly. He knew that Kogo was still quite sour since he had ignored her in search of recreating limitless back then. Even now, she would sometimes pout because he still wished to create it. The only reason she didn't stop him was that, like him, she wished to be the strongest and understood that limitless stacked with her skills would really bring them near the top of power, and even surpass it potentially. Anyway, Kogo, I think this should be enough, but I wouldn't stop here. What about one last attack? Hey, I thought you would never say that. Let's go. Standing far away, Ishin was prepared to send a second and far stronger Getsuga when he suddenly felt a chill. Focusing on Gojo, he saw him crouch down before jumping high in the sky, easily reaching more than 100 meters. Once there, the wings behind him unruffled widely, allowing him to float in the sky, something that should be impossible in the Soul Society without special equipment, such as those belonging to the Shihoin. What is he doing? This question was quickly answered as the wings behind Gojo's back began to slowly expand. Then, when he raised his hand, light began to gather into it before slowly transforming into a 5 meters long lance of light. Even from here, Ishin could already feel that this lance was no joke. But if this was all, then he wouldn't have been worried. The lance began to shrink. Once it lost about half of its initial length, even the color of the lance began to change as it went from pure white to a mix of light and darkness. Ishin, trust me, you better dodge this one. Once those words sounded in Ishin's ears, Gojo simply threw the lance in his direction. Ishin did not need Gojo's warning. The moment Gojo formed that weapon, not only Ishin, but all the others present immediately began to retreat. Even Rangaku and Nemu, who stood nearly 10 kilometers away, retreated without the slightest hesitation, and their judgment was proven right. The lance that appeared to be an amalgamation of light and darkness flew through the air, creating an illusion of distorting the space around it, and hit the place where Ishin stood formerly, but against the expectations of the spectators, the lance capable of tearing space apart merely disappeared. There was a short instant of complete silence, a silence so deadly that it felt as though the world had come to a standstill. It even started to make Ishin and the others doubt whether everything was an illusion or not. It was at this moment that, boom, with the thunderous sound of an explosion, a blinding light occupied everyone's vision before a mushroom of dust rose so high in the sky that it could be seen from several kilometers away. The very atmosphere seemed to be repulsed as a shockwave spread apart from the point of impact, covering several kilometers and absolutely destroying everything in its wake. The air burned, the wind stirred, and all sounds in the space of the explosion vanished, replaced by a silence full of devastation and destruction. It was like the aftermath of a nuclear explosion. When the explosion finally stopped, all that could be seen was a deep crater spanning more than a kilometer. At the same time, the aftereffect of the explosion affected a radius of more than 15 kilometers. Wearing his black glasses while being surrounded by a shield constructed of light, Gojo admired his handcraft with awe but at the same time a little dissatisfaction. This was a skill he had created while inspiring himself from the principle of a nuclear fission. It was without a doubt a very powerful skill. But Gojo was in no way happy. After all, it was too slow. Fights between high-level people went so fast that even simple sonic speed was too slow. Just to release this technique, he had to stand and compress reishi to the utmost for several seconds. Even more so, the quantity was so high that even he had to be careful with his control. As such, not only could he not fight while creating it, the lance could blow up in his face if he made even a small mistake. The question was, would someone be dumb enough to stand and watch without doing anything as the enemy prepared his ultimate attack in a life or death match? Obviously not. The ideal form for this attack would be a combination of bindings, to stop the enemy from moving, and then finishing things off with the explosion. Well, this is a good start for this experiment. He talked to himself but could hear nothing. When he used his finger to touch his ears, he could feel blood leaking from it. Looking at the blood in his finger, he frowned. I need to work more on it. Too much time. Too slow. Wasting too much energy. Easy to avoid and so on. But, it would become better with time. A smile formed on his face as he thought about it before abruptly turning serious when he saw the full extent of the damages he had caused. One worry immediately appeared in his mind. They won't make me pay a fine because of the destruction, right? Chapter 82. Lucky. In the end, he was indeed forced to pay a fine. His attack wasn't radioactive like a true nuclear bomb, but it was quite unfriendly for a reishi-filled environment. In a way, the moment the lance reached its target, the explosion would feed on the reishi in the surrounding area to grow progressively stronger. Simply put, he didn't destroy the surroundings. He erased them. Even now, 3 days later, the place where his explosion went off was still forbidden for civilians of the Rukongai. Because of this, not only was he docked 3 years of salary, he had been forbidden from ever using that technique in Soul Society. He had also been forbidden from fighting against any captains or vice captains. The Central 46 had decided to give him the same restrictions as a first or second seat, and from now on, like them, if he entered the human world he would receive a seal and see his strength restricted to simply 20%. For once, Gojo had nothing to say against these measures. Aside from during a great emergency, all captains and vice captains received this seal when they entered the human world. It was a necessary measure because people at their level could negatively affect the world with their spiritual pressure alone. Of course, with his perfect control this wasn't really a problem. But he didn't wish to debate uselessly. Worst case scenario, he would just break the seal himself if it was necessary. Thankfully, this event wasn't only filled with negative results. Before, when rumors of him gunning for the position of captain had spread, not many were supportive. After all, they thought that he was at most equal to a very powerful vice captain. But now the voices doubting him had lowered greatly. At the end of the day, no matter how they tried to hide it by acting like gentlemen, the Gote 13 was a place where the strong was respected. As for Isshin and Jashiro, they had already agreed to support him during the vote. Thankfully, he wasn't the only one who had his salary suspended. The same happened to all the people present at the scene. Thinking about the distressed faces of Rangaku and Isshin, Gojo couldn't help but laugh. So, you are still in the mood to laugh. Hey, Momo, how have you been? As for the mood to laugh, trust me, even in death I would not hesitate to laugh. Gojo smiled as he turned toward the source of the voice. Opening his arms wide, he grinned as Momo hesitated a little before hugging. Haha, let me look at you. Well, it seems like you became way stronger. The Kido Corps is treating you well, I hope. Once they separated, Gojo sized Momo up and down as he commented. Over the years, Momo had not changed much, physically speaking. But the aura around her had become far sharper. She was wearing a short white kimono with wide sleeves and had tied her hair into twin tails. Normally, in the Kido Corps, all the normal members wore standard uniforms that hid their faces. Meanwhile, those who had reached a higher rank or showed promise had more freedom in the way they dressed. Momo blushed a little at the praise as she murmured, I have worked hard. Indeed. Gojo patted her head gently, good job. She beamed at him before asking, could you introduce me to your friend? At Nobleman at. Gojo nodded, look at me, I nearly forgot. Momo, Nemu, vice captain of the 12th division. Nemu, Momo, a member of the Kido Corps and a friend of mine in the. Hello. The two of them bowed in greeting. Momo was not particularly surprised to see a beautiful woman following behind Gojo. She was already used to such sights. This was why she changed topics and asked what really interested her. Why do you think we were called? Currently, they were in the office of the 2nd Division after receiving a summon from the captain's Hell Butterfly. No matter how close that woman was to Gojo, it was impossible for someone unrelated to join in such a discussion. This means that the 2nd Division, or more precisely the Secret Force, had called for the Healing Division and the Kido Corps. Gojo shrugged, don't know. My captain had tried to ask but all she received was silence. Basically our departments have been asked to send their best members below captain rank. Speaking of which, he was rather surprised that Momo was the one to come. As if she could understand his thoughts, Momo shook her head, I have just been sent as a representative of the representative in a way. The Vice Kido Chief, the one who should have come, is my teacher. I see. Well, I believe everyone is here. Their discussion was interrupted when the door was suddenly opened by Soy Fan. Sweeping the place with her eyes, she gave a nod and took place on the throne-like chair situated on a podium. I believe introductions are unnecessary, but even so, I am Soi Fan, captain of the 2nd and the commander-in-chief of the Secret Force. I have recently contacted the highest authorities in the 4th and 12th Division as well as the Keto Corps because of a top-secret mission I received from Central 46. Soi Fan did not waste time as she began to explain the gist of the matter. Momo showed an uncomfortable expression when the order of total annihilation was mentioned, but she did not protest. She understood very well that any such protest would fall on deaf ears. Once Soi Fan finished her explanation, Gojo asked, "So let me repeat. Our targets are hidden in one of the dimensions outside of the human's world, Hueco Mundo or the Soul Society. Most likely, the Valley of Screams 1. Indeed. Valley of Screams are pocket dimensions created from the accumulation of souls that got lost in the way between the human world and the Soul Society. Our targets most likely hid in one of them after being exiled from the Soul Society. Hey, and to find them we need to search through the Dongai, is that it?" "Yes. Why are you making me repeat myself?" "Ha ha ha. Sorry. I just wanted to confirm." Gojo laughed lightly while trying to hide his true feelings. Lucky. It seemed that it was time to test his theory about Dongai being the solution for creating Limitless. If this failed, then he would have no other choice than to enter Hueco Mundo. Either way, this promised to be interesting. 1. Valleys of Screams were first introduced in the film Memory of Nobody. Even though the film isn't canon, the valleys were once again introduced in Bleach during the Blood War. So the Valley of Screams became canon. The same happened with the Hell movie and now the Hell chapter. Chapter 83. Did you say, festival? After the reunion was finished, Momo hurriedly left to go make her report. The operation would happen in 1 week once all the preparations were finalized. Since they would have to travel through the Dongai and most likely Garganta, using Shinigami below the level of 3rd seat or at least vice captain would be simply a waste of time. Despite this, be it to open a special Senkaimon that directly lead to Dongai or stopping the activity in the Dongai itself, they would need at least one complete squad of both the Keto Corps and the Science Department. The Healing Department would also send a squad to act as support. In the end, the main force would be Soi Fan, and the other high-ranked member of the Secret Force, as well as Gojo. For Gojo, this operation held a completely different meaning than simply killing some exiled nobles who were up to mischief. It meant a high chance of getting a hint toward the creation of Limitless, or something much more. Creating a technique from nothing was extremely hard. One of the reasons he managed to recreate his domain expansion, Infinite Void, was mainly because he had access to books and information about the creation of barriers in this world. Since domain expansion was in reality nothing more than the highest form of barrier manipulation, he had been able to extrapolate and create his own blend. Though, its effects were far more savage. Now here was the problem. All research about space and time were forbidden in Soul Society, with death being the punishment. The very few archives about those topics were sealed deep in the library of the Central 46. Gojo was the kind of man who refused to put all his eggs in one basket. He had different ways to reach his goal, and if everything else failed, he would simply flip the entire table. Some may call him a rogue, but he believed that he was merely realistic. The Dongai was a place where time was disturbed to the highest degree. He really hoped that the search would yield sufficient results. When Gojo went back to his home with Nemu following him, he was once again surprised by how obedient she was. During this week together, he had, many times, thought about making her wear a maid uniform. Sadly, the maid culture, as in the one in Japan, was only born in 2001. Currently, the only kind of maids known were European ones, and he really wasn't attracted by those uniforms that covered their whole bodies. Not to mention, it would be quite provocative for a vice captain to wear white and black. The poor girl was traumatized enough as it was. There was no need to sprinkle salt on the already existing wounds. He also knew that rumors about him being in a relationship with Nemu were already sprouting, but he honestly did not care. If it did not affect his interests, he did not really care about how the world saw him. Be it a hero or a scoundrel, he would always live in the way that pleased him and brought him the greatest amount of fun. He was brought back from his thoughts when he saw a steaming cup of tea placed in front of him. Trailing the fair hands that were holding it, Gojo's gaze slowly stopped on an impressive bust before raising further and crossing gazes with the beautiful but melancholic woman. Even though she was a woman of few words, her inquisitive eyes were scanning him while holding an unspoken question. Smiling, He took the tea from her hand and took a leisurely sip. Delicious tea. How was it made? Not only was the tea good, but he could also taste a large amount of honey in it, making this brew sweet, much in line to his preferences. The tea leaves were gifted by Vice Captain Azane Katetsu during one of your absences. Hey, I really like this woman. I guess after 1,000 years of serving tea to Unohana she found her own way. He chuckled a little as he said so. Sometimes, he even wondered if he was acting in too much hurry. His lifespan could only be counted in the thousands. At this level, 10, 50, or even 200 years would mean nothing. Why did he have to rush so fast to get power? But every time such thoughts appeared, he would mock it in disdain. The reason Azane could enjoy brewing tea for more than 1,000 years was that she had someone powerful enough to support her and she was quite strong herself. Meanwhile, every day, many Shinigamis died during their fights against hollows. At the end of the day, what mattered was personal power. It is said that being at the top is lonely. For Gojo, who once reigned at the top of the Jujutsu world, he understood this truth better than anyone. When you became too strong, you had no equal and no one to share your worries with. You would either be looked up at with reverence, or regarded with fear. But, between being alone at the top of the food chain, or having a bunch of friends you could lose at any moment because you were too weak, he obviously liked the former option more. What's more, this time, even if he once again managed to reach the top, he wouldn't be alone, would he? You're damn right. The voice of Kogo soothed his heart. Having someone who understood everything about you and that you could trust from the bottom of your heart was a rather nice feeling. Thanks to Kogo's words and the good tea, Gojo was more relaxed than ever and suddenly asked, "Now that I think about it, in 2 days, it will be Oben, right?" Nemu tilted her head at the sudden question before searching through her memory and answered shortly. Indeed. Gojo smiled. When they had visited the Shiba, both the eldest sister and the youngest brother had been absent. It seemed that they had been busy preparing for a festival. From what he knew of the Shiba family, they specialized in fireworks and they always organized that party. Oben was also known as the Festival of the Dead. In Japan, it happened every year, but here, it only happened every 10 years, in the first few districts of the Rukongai. Souls of the deceased, participating in the Festival of the Dead, hey, how could I miss it? Hey, Nemu. Sizing her up and down, he asked, do you have a kimono or yukata? Other than your uniform, I mean. Looking at her blank expression, Gojo's lips curled into a smile of anticipation. This festival promised to be a very interesting day. Chapter 84. Enticements and Promises. Looking through his window, Shunsui could feel that the mood in the Soul Society had been a little energetic recently. The Festival of Oben was one of the few entertaining activities in Soul Society. It wasn't just a festival for the sake of it. It was a way to lay the souls down to rest and facilitate the passage of the souls of civilians in the Rukongai toward reincarnation, while accepting new members at the same time. Every day, millions of people die on Earth, and every day, millions of children are born. For Shinigami, the protection of the cycle was the most important. This festival wasn't just for the civilians that were alive, but also for those that died in the Soul Society. When a human dies, they enter the cycle of reincarnation. On the way, some may become hollows, or some may become Shinigamis. But what happened when a soul was destroyed in Soul Society? It was rather simple, like how a human body became dust and fused with the earth, a soul body would decompose into pure reishi and become a nutrient for Soul Society itself. Though, the more powerful a soul was, the more complicated this would be. What are you thinking, Captain? I am just wondering about how beautiful my little Naneo will be in her kimono tomorrow. Hey, I am certain that a silver-haired man with a blindfold that should not be named will be very pleased. Joking in order to replace his thoughts, Shunsui focused on his vice captain, Naneo eyes. When he looked at her, he would always think of the little brat walking around with a large book in her hand. Back then, his ex-vice captain, Lisa Yadomaru, had been the one to take care of Naneo in the division. Though, 60 years ago, Lisa had been burdened with a crime that was in no way her fault. Most Shinigami did not know the reasons why so many first and second seats had been deemed as criminals back then, but how could he not know? Back then, Kazuki Urahara, who was the captain of the 12th Division, and Tessai Tsukabishi, the captain of the Kido Corps, had been arrested for the crime of experimenting on Shinigami. Lisa and the others who had been half-transformed in hollows were sentenced to be executed as though they were hollows. The one who saved them was none other than Yoruichi Shihoin. In the end, their groups fled to the human world. The Central 46 had been very enraged back then, ordering the Gote 13 to chase after them, but most Shinigami only accepted this order in form. Aside from the members of the first divisions, the other divisions simply sent unseated Shinigami who did not even try all that hard. This event had been too fishy. Shunsui lamented secretly. Sometimes, he cursed his indecisiveness. After the death of his brother, he swore to protect his wife and daughter, but all he could do was watch as she was executed for losing the treasure of the Eyes clan. Even though she had acted in hope of breaking the curse. Later he took in Nanao in his division, he was too much of a coward to admit that she was his niece and that he had been unable to help her mother. Finally, he could do nothing as his vice captain was sentenced to execution and had to flee to the human world. The true culprit. His expression grew colder. He did not believe that Kazuki or Tessei were the culprits. In fact, they were the saviors. It meant that the traitor was still alive and well, strutting openly in the Gote 13. He had some doubts about Aizen Sosuke. After all, he had been the one who profited the most from those events. Sadly, that man's reputation was spotless. In fact, Aizen could be said to be the most popular and loved captain in all the Gote 13. But this did not matter. He knew that sooner or later, another similar event would happen. Perhaps once again, someone would have to be executed. But, as long as there was anything fishy, even the slightest bit, he swore that he would not let it happen, even if he had to fight the old man Yamamoto for this. Thankfully, seeing Nanao flush at his previous question managed to alleviate his brooding mood. He leaned on his chair. So, are you finally going to snatch him up? His lips curled as he asked with a teasing undertone. Teasing her and joking around with her was one of the few things that made his life less boring. Finally calming down, Nanao adjusted her glasses and coughed. There is no one I need to snatch up. He simply smiled at this obvious lie. He knew that Nanao's feelings for Gojo were far from what could be called love. More precisely, it was a sliver of love mixed with feelings of self-doubt, escapism and fear. It did not help that Gojo did not really seem like the kind of man to settle down and marry. Well, you should be careful. From what Jashiro told me, it seems like his relationship with Vice Captain Matsumoto is really ambiguous. Shunsui sighed a little. Relationships in the Seraiti were a little complicated. At the end of the day, Shinigami society was no different than the human one. They fell in love, married, and had children. The greatest problem was their nearly endless lifespans. Powerful Shinigami or nobles could live for centuries at the very minimum. In theory, Shinigami at the level of captains could live for 10,000s of years as long as they weren't killed. In fact, Shunsui knew that some members of the Division Zero, like their captain Ikebe Hyasube, had been living for a few millions years. Because of this lifespan, most Shinigami never entered into a relationship. In fact, currently, out of all captains and vice captains, the only one in official relationship was Kaion Shiba. Byakuya could also be counted, but he was widowed. In short, Shinigami had a hard time entering into a committed relationship. But once they did, they would never separate no matter what. And if one of the partners happened to die, then the one living would never replace him or her. For Satoru Gojo, as long as he just played around it wouldn't be a problem. But if he entered a serious relationship, Nanao's chances would become rather slim or she would have to share him. It wasn't like polygamous relationship were rare for nobles. First Division. While most divisions were in a festive mood, somewhere deep in the First Division, a showdown was happening. On a ring surrounded by translucent barriers, lightning and ice warred against each other, destroying everything around them. The fight was between a middle-aged man with silver-gray hair and a young kid with silver-white hair. Even though they moved so fast few people could see what was happening, it was easy to observe that the ice was slowly being suppressed. Finally, that's enough. The two of them stopped after hearing the middle-aged man speak. Huff huff huff. Gasping for breath, his face covered in sweat, Toshiro spoke with difficulty. I lost. Again. His vision was already a little hazy due to exhaustion. Oh ho ho. Young Toshiro, you shouldn't belittle yourself. I am someone strong enough to be a captain, you know. For you to face me and not lose instantly shows how much you have grown. Back then you could not even take a hit. Toshiro nodded, while sweeping his frustration away. Shojiro Sasaki, the vice captain of the First Division, had already awakened and mastered his Bankai long ago. In fact, he should have been the one to become the captain of the Third Division, but he had refused since he wished to continue serving Captain Yamamoto. Toshiro understood that he still had a long way to go before matching someone like him. At Nobleman at. Why are you so frustrated? Is it because of the recent news? Toshiro lowered his head and spoke in a low voice. I promised Gojo-Nisan that I would not see him before I reach a level he could be proud of. But after learning he fought an all-out battle with Captain Ishin, I began to feel a little distraught. Chojiro smiled. If any other Shinigami heard Toshiro complain, they would curse him. The boy was already insanely talented, and at this rate, he should be able to reach and master Bankai in less than 10 years. Since the moment Toshiro entered this division, he had trained many times with the young boy and knew how hardworking he was. Even so, he did not utter those words. Only mediocre men were happy in stagnation. The great men should always fight to reach higher heights and accomplish their dreams. He also knew that Toshiro's end goal was not the first division. You said you wished to enter the third division, right? Taking a deep breath, Toshiro straightened his back as he answered, indeed. I didn't just have a promise with Nisan. I also had another promise, or rather, a bet with a friend of mine. He smiled refreshingly as he finished. We made a bet, between the two of us, about who would become the vice captain working under him. Chapter 85. Nemu. Standing in front of a mirror, Nemu looked at her reflection with a dazed expression on her face. The seamstresses of the Seraiti were extremely skilled, as such, making clothes that fitted her had been a breeze. That was why she was in this situation now, facing an image of herself she did not recognize. Rather than the usual black kimono, she was wearing a colorful blue and gold one, though as short as her usual clothes. Her usual ponytail had been untied, letting her long and beautiful black hair flow freely behind her. Even though her face was still devoid of smile, the overall gloomy impression she always gave off had greatly dissipated. For Nemu, this image of her was something so foreign and alien that for a short moment she had a hard time believing it was really her. All her life she had always been mistreated and ignored. The greatest amount of warmth she received was being bestowed a name. Initially, her name was not Nemu Kuratsuchi, but rather, Nanago Nimari, which could be translated as, sleeping # 7 feet. The seventh and only success from the experiment known as the Nimari Project. A project which had only one goal, the creation of new souls outside of the cycle of reincarnation. For her, Mayuri was both her creator and father, and her loyalty for him was unquestionable. Despite this, the only time she felt really happy was when she was given his name. At least, that was until now. The time she had spent with Gojo had been the strangest days of her life. It was like she was walking in a foggy dream she could not wrap her head around with. Not only did Gojo not mistreat her, but in fact, he was always very considerate towards her. At first, she had thought that he must have been a naturally kind person. That she was not particularly special or anything. But the little time she spent with him made her forget such thoughts. Added Nobleman at. Even though he was not evil, Gojo could not exactly be called a kind and virtuous man either. She then wondered if he was interested in her body. But, even though she could see some appreciation in his eyes, she never really saw any great form of lust either. When she asked him why he was helping her, he answered that it was simply because he wished to study her origin. But, if it was really the truth, he did not have to treat her so kindly. The difference in power between the two of them was like a gulf she could not see the end of. Even though his eyes could see many things, simply killing her and studying her body would be far easier. She could not understand. Kindness was a concept unknown to her. True happiness was a concept unknown to her. Love, friendship, appreciation, every such positive feeling was an equally incomprehensible concept to her. It was like she was living in another world. Nowadays, she has had trouble sleeping. Every time she did so, it would be with the fear that she would wake up one day and find that everything had been nothing more than an illusion, just a mere dream. Oh, seems like those girls really did a good job. Turning around, she could see Gojo leaning against the door of the room he had assigned to her. She still had a hard time calling it her room. She was at once dazed by the sight, though for a different reason. She wasn't the only one who had changed clothes. For the festival, Gojo had opted for a black haori with a blue hem and blue sleeve. Under it, he wore a completely white top and equally white pants. Aside from this, he did not wear any blindfold nor glasses as he usually did. Oh, I just thought it would be a waste if I couldn't see everything this festival had to offer. Even though his perception had increased, increasing the amount of information he had to process together with it, he also became more skilled. What's more, now that he had Kogo, he had no particular worry about his eyes. After all, he didn't just heal but completely reconstructed the nerves in his brain. This had the advantages of being far less painful than when he burned and healed his brain cells when he was alive, and it was also more thorough. The only reason he still used protection was that, at the end of the day, pain was still pain and he had no reason to force himself since he still didn't unlock the neutral mode of limitless. Well then, shall we go? Nemu nodded calmly and gave one last look at the mirror before following him outside. She did not know when it had happened, but following behind him and watching his back gave her a sense of security she never thought she would ever feel. Oben was a pretty simple festival, it was mainly to honor the dead and the ancestors. During the festival, lanterns would be hung in front of houses, dances would be performed, and graves visited. In the end, floating lanterns would be put into rivers and lakes in order to guide back spirits in their world. Since this festival only affected the souls in the Rukongai, few if any members of the Seraiti participated. Of course, that was only for the nobles. The majority of the members of the Gote 13 would always try to participate as long as they weren't too busy. After all, most of them were from Rukongai, and in a way this festival was related to them. Walking outside of the Seraiti, Gojo was amazed at how bright everything seemed to look. The cynical part of him laughed inwardly, since this festival only concerned the first few districts of Rukongai. He doubted that people from districts like the 80th even cared about it. But this knowledge wasn't enough to dampen his mood. Even when he was alive, atrocities happened every time and everywhere in the world. If he had to stop having fun because of it, he would die in sadness and melancholy. The streets were filled with sounds of laughter and music. Stalls could be seen in everything, proposing games and food of all kinds. After stopping at his favorite dango shop and buying some for him and Nemu, they continued to walk around for a short while. Tilting his head, Gojo stopped and looked behind him. Nemu, who usually walked no farther than a few steps behind him, was still standing in front of a stall. It was rather surprising since he knew that few things ever interested her. Hey, what caught your attention? He asked, tracing his steps back and catching up to her, and looked at what the old man was selling. Oh, I didn't think you were interested in jewelry. It's the same color as your eyes. Nemu answered with a small voice as her gaze remained fixated on a particular jewel. At first glance, it looked like a lapis lazuli, but the blue was far more clearer. It was as if looking at the vast sky itself. Smiling, he asked, "Do you want it?" Nemu did not know how to answer. In all her life, she had never once asked anything for herself. The simple reason was that she never had anything she wished for. It was the first time that she really desired something. She opened her mouth with difficulty. Her throat felt dry as if a lump was stopping her from voicing her thoughts. She was afraid that the first thing she ever wished for would be refused. Still, she gripped the hem of her skirt and murmured in a voice so small it was barely audible. I really want it. She immediately closed her eyes in reflex, as if expecting to receive a hit. But all she felt was a warm hand at the top of her head. See, it wasn't that hard, was it? The gentle but mischievous smile on his face under the moonlight was something she would never forget. Chapter 86. Ai's Clan. After the episode with the jewel, Gojo could feel that Nemu's mood had drastically improved. Even though she was still walking behind him, the distance was not particularly wide. Sometimes, he could also see her lips curl up slightly. Clearly, the gift he gave her was really to her taste. Gojo was not the kind of person to half-ass what he ought to do. Initially, Nemu had nothing to do with him and it would have been fine to continue like this. But, since he decided to take care of her, he would go all the way. It didn't matter what would happen. The greatest despair wasn't born from the lack of hope, but rather when a flicker of hope bloomed in your heart, only to be smashed apart in front of your helpless eyes. While he was thinking, Gojo. The voice of a man sounded not far from him, someone he easily recognized. Hello, Kyan. The festival you have organized is pretty well done. Ain't it? Kyan gave a boyish smile as he nodded to Nemu. He knew that the girl was a little shy and reclusive, so he didn't wish to bother her too much. My little bro Gonju is taking care of the South Rukongai. Kukaku is taking care of the East. Ishin is in the North. So, here I am. Hey, so you are the only house taking care of everything. Nah. The three of them began to walk in another direction, far from the stalls. The Shiba house wasn't always a bottom rung, you know. We were pretty high up. Though stuff happened. And well, here we are. Even so, for the festival, we have other minor houses help. For example, the Yukataki house is helping us here. The Omaeda clan also help, though ha ha ha. Yeah, they are a pretty weird bunch. The Omaeda clan was another house affiliated with the Shihoin, like the Fawn clan. The difference, though, lay in the fact that while the Fawn worked as the guardians and assassins, the Omaeda worked as the merchants. This made them one of the richest families below the four great clans. But they had the problem of looking down on the poor. The first time he met Marekio Omaeda, vice captain of the 2nd Division, the meeting ended with Marekio being sent to the 4th Division for healing. Of course, Gojo was a pacifist. He did not like violence. As such, Marekio only suffered through some minor concussions. The two of them continued to discuss like this as they advanced further away. His relationship with Kayan had been simply cordial in the past, but since the day he saved Rukia and indirectly, his wife, the two of them had been pretty close. Once he got to know him better, Gojo had to admit that this man made him think of Yuji quite a bit. Of course, there was some difference here and there, but that was it. I should really stop judging people by comparing them to my old world. Gojo knew that he was developing a nasty habit. But at the same time, it wasn't his fault if so many people he met had similar personalities to those he knew back when he was alive. After walking a while, they finally reached a clearing where a giant cannon could be seen. The cannon could easily reach 2 meters in length and was pointed toward the sky. Beaming with pride, Kayan spoke, "Our family specializes in fireworks. It might be a humble job, but it's an honest and respectable one. Out of us all, Kukaku is the most skilled in that craft. She is the one who did the calculations for the creation of those babies. Anyway, ahem, see that hill over there. Could you please go there? It will be the ideal spot. Also, Miss Nemu, could you accompany Miyako? We plan to have a bonfire after the festival reaches its end." Nemu tilted her head before looking at Gojo silently. "Go help them. At Nobleman at. He gave his assent at her silent question and then looked at the hill thoughtfully. He briefly wondered if he should use his eyes to see clearly what or who was there, but finally decided against doing so. Whatever surprise they had in store for him, it wouldn't be interesting if he spoiled himself beforehand. "Well, I am going." Ignoring Kayan's bad acting, he began to walk toward the hill that had been pointed. He could have rushed, but he had no reason to. Even so, it only took him a few short minutes to finally reach his target. What a beautiful night. Right, Naneo. Standing close to a tree, clad in a night blue traditional kimono, Naneo calmly swept a strand of hair before turning to face him. "How have you been?" Gojo gave a stiff smile. He had an inkling of what was about to happen, but for once, he hoped that he was wrong. Chapter 87. Eyes Clan 2. How have you been? Standing on the hill and looking at the man who was standing a few meters away from her, Naneo asked quietly. Since her discussion with her captain, she had been filled with a feeling of trepidation and angst. Of course, even though she denied all the allegations of her captain, she understood why she felt like this. "I have been pretty well. What about you?" Naneo chuckled. This discussion is so awkward. Satoru was anything but a dense man. In fact, she doubted that any man would be so dense as to not understand what was about to happen when thrown in a situation like this one. Even she had to admit that seeing the usually calm and carefree Gojo acting like this because of her made her happy. This showed that she had a special place in his heart, even if not the place she wished she had. Hiding a smile, Naneo turned around and looked at the moon standing high up. Naneo hated the night, she hated the moon even more so. Not out of fear, but for the simple reason that it would always remind her of that fateful night. Opening her mouth, Naneo talked quietly. "Satoru. Yes. Would you be willing to hear a story? I love stories." Even though she was showing her back to him, she could already feel that the usual Satoru was back. An infuriating man, always full of confidence. A frivolous man, who never took anything seriously. A selfish man, who could watch the world burn without lifting an eyebrow. At the same time, he was a man who would retaliate at the slightest grievances and who would never give up on those he cared about. In the end, he was a complex man full of contradictions, and in a way, this was what made his charm. My taste in men is really weird. Of course, the fact that he was ridiculously handsome also helped. Naneo was no hypocrite, even though appearance was not the first criteria, nor even the second. Having a good appearance always helped. Letting out a bell-like laugh, she finally began after adjusting her glasses. My name is Naneo Eyes, the heiress of the Eyes clan. She placed a hand on her stomach. Did you know? The Eyes clan is matrilineal. There have been only female births in all the history of our clan. As such, the clan would always take husbands from other families in the clan. This isn't something particularly notable. Even though the other clans do not have a case where only women are born, there are still matriarchal clans or clans where a woman took control. The most notable of such examples was the Kasumioji family, a matriarchal clan of master weaponsmiths, and who are only below the four great noble families. Another example would be the Shihoin and the Feng, which, while not being matriarchal, did not shun women from obtaining power. But, there's one part that is a little different from everyone else. A bitter smile formed on her face as she reached this part. Satoru, how long do you think someone from a noble clan can live? I guess a few centuries at the very minimum. Indeed. But you see, all the men who joined the Eyes clan died an early death. Most, not even lasting a decade. People call this phenomenon the Eyes curse. Quote. My father, I never got to know my father. He died while my mother was still pregnant. What's more, he was from the Kyoraku family, a major noble family. So you can imagine how strong he should have been. Kyoraku. Indeed. Shunsui Kyoraku, my captain, is also my uncle, or at least I think he is. I only know that my father is from the same clan. She shook her head. This wasn't the moment to get distracted. The Eyes clan has four great characteristics. It's a clan only composed of women, it's a cursed clan, it's a clan of Shinto priestesses, and finally, it's a clan without Zanpakuto, or rather, a clan with only one Zanpakuto Shinken Hakioken 1. So, that's why you only focused on Kido. Yes, for one, I am really talented in Kido. At the same time, I am fundamentally unable to imprint an Asachi. The Shinken Hakioken is passed in each generation to the next heir. Gojo's eyes narrowed. A Zanpakuto that is passed on in each generation. This was something that did not make any sense. A Zanpakuto wasn't just some kind of treasure sword. It was a being born from the soul of the user, and the two were linked in life and death. As long as the Shinigami was alive, a Zanpakuto could never be completely destroyed. But when a Shinigami died, the soul in the Zanpakuto would slowly deteriorate after losing its connection before dying. What would be left would be nothing more than a husk, an Asachi without a soul that could be imprinted by another Shinigami, and that would give birth to a new soul that had nothing to do with the precedent. From what he knew, this was how Zaraki obtained a Zanpakuto without entering the academy, by imprinting on an ownerless Asachi. But what Nanao was saying completely broke this law. Everything else aside, using this Zanpakuto would mean fusing with a soul that wasn't yours. Thankfully, Gojo wasn't the kind who stayed tied down to common sense. Since it existed, then it meant it was possible. Whether he could accept it or not would not change the reality of the situation. As such, he began to focus more on why it was possible. Perhaps this is why only the heiress can use it. If he linked it to an organ transplant, there would be a question of compatibility. Perhaps it was a question of blood. Perhaps the soul in the Zanpakuto only wanted to help the heir of his first partner. From the fact that you don't have the sword, I guess something happened. Quote. Officially, my mother lost it and thus was sentenced to death by the Central 46. For losing a sacred treasure that belonged to us. Nanao's voice took a dark edge before she calmed down. It was so ridiculous. What was even the point of the execution? Why did they not even try to understand the circumstances of their clan? Both Nanao and Gojo understood that there was more to it, but neither Gojo asked nor Nanao said anything. She may be in love, but she was not stupid. It wasn't even a question about trust. Until now, everything she said was no secret and only concerned her. But the information about Shinken Hakioken was something that wouldn't only affect her if it was revealed. It was something her mother died for without hesitation, and a burden her captain carried for decades. All of this, only to protect her. All of this, done in the slim hope that casting the sword away would not result in her being cursed and that she would be allowed to fall in love without fearing her husband dying. At a nobleman at. As such, Nanao would be insulting their resolve if she divulged this secret without at least the permission of her captain. I see. This was all he could say. Still, why is she telling me all that? He thought at first that she wanted to confess or something of the like, but now, it did not seem so. What could it be? As if she could feel his doubts, Nanao finally turned toward him, a beautiful smile on her face. Satoru, you are not from this world, right? 1-8 Mirror's Divine Sword. Chapter 88. Eyes Clan 3. Gojo stayed silent, his eyes expressing neither shock nor surprise. His heart rate did not even go up. Even seeing his friend alive after technically having killed him a few years ago only shocked him for a second in relative time and only 60 seconds in his own subjective time. Though, that resulted in him being sealed, which was quite ironic. Generally, It was the good guys sealing the Demon King because he was too powerful and dangerous, but in his case, the situation got completely reversed. Currently, Gojo could accelerate his own subjective time up to 180 times that of a normal person, and he did not hesitate to do so. How did she find it? Why now? What should he answer? Those three questions swam in his head as he thought about the most appropriate solution. In the end, he decided that all Nanao had should have been speculation. Then, he just had to play dumb all the way. Allying his own perception with that of the world, he tilted his head to the side and showed an expression of confusion as he asked. What do you mean? If it's about me being human when I was alive, you could say that I am indeed not from this world. Nanao, who had been observing him, did not seem surprised at this answer. Satoru, you can fool everyone, even Captain Unohana, but you can't fool me. Remember, I was the one who helped you in creating, or should I say, recreating your cursed technique. Quote. You said it yourself, right? This isn't Kido, but Jujutsuki. You know, I have searched in all records of history in Japan, and while I have seen some weird techniques used by people with spiritual power, what you have created falls in none of those categories. Quote. I mean, in the first place, it's weird, isn't it? How could someone who did not even know the basics about Kido suddenly create an entirely new system? For others, you created your techniques after learning Kido. But, I know better. After all, I was there from the beginning. I even remember how surprised you were when the effects were stronger than what you expected. Quote. You see, Satoru, one of your greatest personality flaws is that you unconsciously look down on anyone who is weaker than you. Nowadays you mellowed out, but back then, 5 years ago, your head was pretty swollen with pride. I am sure that in your mind, it was simply impossible for anyone to find your secret. Gojo closed his eyes and smiled wryly as he passed his fingers through his hair. It was true that when he just entered the Soul Society, he honestly did not take the Shinigamis in general seriously. In the deepest part of his mind, he still saw himself as Satoru Gojo, the strongest sorcerer, rather than Satoru Gojo, the Shinigami. It didn't help that most teachers in the academy were not that impressive. It was only after fighting Akaku then Unohana, that he understood keenly that he was not who he used to be anymore and that this world was far stronger than his previous one. Opening his eyes, he looked quietly at Nanao. Should he admit it? At the end of the day, all she had were speculations. Even if she was sure of it herself, she had absolutely no proof regarding it. It was just as he was debating what to do that Nanao took a step back. Before there's any misunderstanding, I am not trying to force you to admit anything. I am completely sure about my deductions and nothing you say will change my mind. Everyone has the right to keep their own secret. In the same way that I can't tell you everything about me, I do not expect you to tell me everything about you. I just have one question. Quote. Go on. Her expression showed an unexpected seriousness. How confident are you in dealing with a curse? Gojo let out a light laugh at this question. I see, so your interest for me was not because of my handsome face but rather my skills. Nanao's face flushed a little but she coughed a little to calm herself down, which only made Gojo laugh louder. This situation had been something quite novel for Gojo. It was the first time he had been suppressed so much by someone who was so much weaker than him. From the beginning, she had perfect and absolute control over the discussion, controlling the pace as she wanted. He had to admit, this was quite a new experience for him. Once he stopped laughing, Gojo strode slowly toward her and only stopped just one step away from her. Because of their difference in heights, she had to raise her head to look at him, and could not help but get lost as she stared into his eyes. Gojo's lips curled into a sly grin as he pinched her and lowered his face towards her. Flustered at the sudden attack, all she could do was close her eyes before feeling a hot breath tickle her ear, before feeling her earlobe being gently bitten by him, greatly startling her as she took a step back, her face completely red and her heart beating like a drum. At Nobleman at. This was for messing with me. Then, placing his hand on her hair, he gave a large smile as he finished. As for curse, trust me, I am a professional when it comes to this. Behind him, high in the sky, fireworks exploded, filling the sky with thousands of lights. Chapter 89. Nanao 1. After their discussion on the hill, the two of them found themselves in Nanao's home, a house she had outside of the Gote 13. From what she told him, this part of the Seraiti belonged entirely to her clan. As for Nemu, Gojo had asked Miyako to take care of her. He did not wish to let the girl alone in his house if necessary. Having people around her was the best, and Miyako had the kind of motherly feel he knew would appease Nemu. Naneo's house was more Western than Japanese in style. She said that it was more of a way to rebel a little than anything. In fact, she did not even use this house normally and lived in the quarters belonging to her in the 8th Division's territory. Even now, Gojo could not really retrace what had happened after they reached her house. Be it because of the mood, or because of their discussion, the two of them began to kiss. After their sweet kiss, SATORU and Naneo found themselves in Naneo's room. Even now, as he sat on Naneo's bed, SATORU could still feel the sweet aftertaste and wished for nothing more than to give her another kiss and much more. What's more, they had all the time in the world. As of now, he was currently seated on her king-sized bed, while Naneo stood in front of him with her yukata pinched on both sides and raised. Naneo, who had slowly raised her yukata in a bid to seduce him under the advice of the book she had read, had her skin flushing because of how shameless she was currently acting. Underneath her yukata, she was showing bold sexy white lace underwear. Despite her shame, she had no intention of stopping. After all, she knew that the competition was harsh. SATORU, while a little bemused at first, was now completely savoring the situation as he thoroughly inspected her body with his eyes without blinking. Seeing his lack of reaction, Naneo shivered a little as she asked, "Did I do it the wrong way?" Gojo knew that for a conservative woman like Naneo, what she just did could only be seen as extremely bold. As a man, he couldn't let her do all the work. Smiling, he encouraged her. "That's not true. You're an extremely beautiful woman." Truth be told, the current appearance of Naneo was truly awakening sadistic feelings in him. She seemed so weak and vulnerable while standing there, in front of him, and showing her panties. Hearing that, Naneo's expression had some joy mixed in. Her yukata was still rolled up and her face was still red, but power entered her eyes again. "Come here." He beckoned her with his finger, and once she sat next to him on the bed, he gently put his hand on her thighs. He enjoyed the feeling of her thighs as he stroked them. Even though she still seemed a little tense, she neither escaped nor refused his hand. "Relax, at any moment, if you feel uncomfortable, tell me. I will immediately stop." He spoke in a soothing voice, trying to calm her nerves down. Naneo tried to answer, but her throat was so dry she couldn't emit a sound and could only nod at his words. SATORU understood that in such a situation, words alone were pretty useless. So, he decided to simply take his time and let her gradually adjust to the situation. He let his hand wedge in the closed thighs and began to gently caress her sensitive inner area, waiting for her to loosen little by little. NN. Sweet moan began to leak out of Naneo, something he did not miss, at Novelban at. "How is it?" he whispered sensually before biting her ear, making her shiver in pleasure. "It feels a bit good." Naneo blushed at her words. All of this was pretty new for her, so she did not even really understand what was happening. Judging that the time was right, he made his finger crawl on her wet genital through the panties. This made her yelp in surprise, but as fast as it happened, her expression began to melt even more. "Have you masturbated like this before?" Naneo stammered at this question for a short while before finally shaking her head in denial. She did not know much about sex, and the little she did was mainly thanks to the erotic books Lisa had left. Gojo was a little shocked at first, but once he thought about it, it was pretty normal. He doubted that she really paid attention to sex in the past with the situation about the curse still left unattended. "I really need to go all out." He wished to make her first time a sweet unforgettable memory. Thinking so, he pushed the gusset of her panties aside and began to slide his finger up and down on her moist thin slit. It was tightly shut, but still so alluring. Naneo gripped his clothes tighter but, aside from that, didn't do anything else. He could feel a little apprehension in her, so he hugged her with his free hand. "She seems way smaller than I expected." He had been ready for her entrance to be somewhat small but still not at this level. This made him hesitant about continuing. SATORU, while not too big, was no slouch in the length and girth department. When compounded with her small opening, he feared that it may hurt her far more than he thought it would. "Excuse me." Saying so, he took Naneo in a princess carry and stood up before placing her down on the bed. "SATORU?" she asked a little anxiously at the sudden change of position, but he did not answer. Hovering above her, he looked gently at her before leaving small kisses on the nape of her neck. Once he stopped doing so, he slowly began to disrobe her, revealing the beautiful body underneath. The nape peeking through her disheveled silver hair, her neck, her slender shoulders, the contours of her shoulder blades, the swelling on her chest, and her narrow waist that looked as if it would break if she was held too tight. All those elements mixed gave her an appearance of fragility, further promoting her ethereal beauty. You are really beautiful. Her cheeks were rosy as she bit her lips, she looked adorable. It wasn't empty flattery. Her body was truly very pretty. Her height was just right against his, and her nipples at the top of her round breasts had a pretty, flower-like pink hue. The line that connected her slim waist to her pelvis was beautiful. She was not voluptuous, but her body had a lot of charm. He pecked her lips a few more times, and gradually moved his kisses to her cheek then to her ear. His moist lips kissed behind her ear then down her neck. Open your lips, he commanded in a low voice, murmuring against her ear. She swallowed a hard breath from nerves, her throat hurting slightly. Her face was tinted in a pink hue as she hesitated, but in the end, she let her lips fall apart a little. His eyes seemed to laugh for a moment. Soon, his lips firmly pressed against hers and a soft piece of flesh entered her mouth. Ah! His tongue smoothly ravaged the inside of her mouth. He slowly made his way around her teeth and the sides of her cheeks. She felt a jolting pleasure when his tongue met hers. A moan escaped from deep within her throat. The soft kiss gradually heated up. His gentle tongue suddenly pressed firmly inside her mouth, and when he continued to massage a sensitive spot, she unconsciously ended up firmly grasping the bedsheets. While kissing her, he wrapped his hand around her beautiful breasts, their sizes fitting comfortably in his palm. When compared to his other women, it was without a doubt on the smaller side, but not by much. He continued to knead them with his palm while enjoying the feeling of her breast. It was small yet soft and malleable, the tip was hard, showing that she was aroused. After a while, he slowly separated his mouth from her, only to see her eyes watering. What's wrong? He asked worriedly, hoping that he didn't hurt her. Should I do something? She stammered a little as she asked. She felt so passive, leaving all the work to him. Satoru smiled. He knew where her insecurities were coming from, but calmed her. Normally, yes. But, this is your first time. As such, leave all the work to me. He could see Nanao deflate a little during the first part of his words before changing into joy at the last part. Resuming where he led off, he traced his lips from her neck down to the vicinity of her breasts and began to lick her nipples meticulously. He lightly bit her nipple and tickled it with his tongue. Nanao got breathless as he licked around the areola before sucking on it once more. Her breasts were soft and tender. It was like consuming a mouthful of whipped cream. He was worried they would melt in his mouth. She was quietly laying down in bed while grasping onto the sheets, but her body would tremble while her hips jolted up from time to time. Gradually, he felt his lower half starting to grow hot. He let go of her breast, which was now wet with his saliva, and moved to caress the other one. He licked, sometimes lightly bit, and from time to time sucked with great force. Whenever his tongue moved, a tingling sensation would travel up her spine, and she couldn't help but moan in pleasure. After he teased her breasts to his content, his kisses traveled down to her abdomen. Nanao wondered where his lips would advance next. She was a little scared, but she felt anticipation at the same time. She was gripping onto the sheets so hard that the tips of her fingers turned pale white. Ha! His lips proceeded down to her lower abdomen and then to her inner thighs. They moved toward the places nobody else had touched before. His lips brushed against the deep portions of her inner thighs and began sucking. Ah! Gripping the sheets tightly, Nanao screamed his name. Her body began to shiver for a few seconds as she reached her first climax. This scene astonished him. She is more sensitive than I thought. He could even feel a hot liquid gush on his pants, informing him about her even squirting. Nanao's convulsions continued for a short while before she finally stopped. Satoru, slowly raising his body by using one of his hands, managed to observe her dazed and blushing expression as she breathed roughly. The scent of the room, already filled with hers. Let's continue. This wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. With his right hand, he covered her entire pubis with his palm and softly caressed it to enjoy how it felt. He moved the other hand roughly through her hair and kissed her so passionately it took her breath away. Then the storm of kisses moved down to her neck, to her collarbone, and to her armpit. He took her breast in his hand and brought his other hand to her abdomen. He slowly let his hand brush down her abdomen and naturally slid it down, pressing his fingers toward her inner thigh. Nanao was shocked and stared at him with wide eyes. At that moment, her gaze locked with his. On. He coated his fingers with the love juices flowing from her vagina and rubbed all over the inner labia that had swollen out of arousal. His finger stimulated her softened flesh in every direction like he was stirring her up. A ticklish pleasure soon ruled her crotch. He seemed to be observing her reactions, while exploring her lower regions with a slight pressure. Her breaths became faster and her eyes started to tremble. Watching her, he felt his body burn up. Ah! His long and firm fingers slowly entered her. She yelped, not from pain but from surprise. When his finger slid out, she sighed in relief. But the next moment, he inserted his finger deeper into her. Ah tilde. Something entered. It's just a finger. If it hurts then tell me. He repeatedly moved his finger in and out of her, but it wasn't deep enough to hurt her. She had never let anything inside of her before, so the foreign object felt strange. As the stimulation continued, her lower region became slippery with moist juices, and the sound of wet noises grew increasingly louder. Her whole body was burning with heat and she felt her back shiver reflexively. A few more of his fingers pressed and rubbed against her. A strange, indescribable sensation took over her body whenever his finger entered her. It was a bit ticklish, maybe a little naughty, but good. It seemed a little painful at the same time. Her breathing turned sharp, and she couldn't think of anything but the feelings that were brewing inside her chest. It doesn't hurt. Please don't stop. She had never known how sensitive that part of her body was. She felt as if all her body was on fire. She stifled a scream of pleasure when his fingers captured her clitoris. His thumb and forefinger pinched and lightly rolled around the pleasantly hard flesh bud. Ah tilde. The stimulation was too powerful, so her limbs trembled uncontrollably. He gave a focused vibration to the clitoris held between his two nectar-soaked fingers. Oh, seems like I found another weak spot. Ah stop. And no. What? This feels weird. Ah tilde. The clitoris of most women was sensitive and he was attacking more than just that. He also massaged her left breast, brought the nipple into his mouth, and rolled it around while soaking it with his saliva. Nanao experienced her second climax of the day. One that lasted even longer than the previous one. That should be good enough, he said after seeing her refocus. He stripped off his clothing to reveal the fit body created thanks to all his training. Nanao trembled in embarrassment and worry as he grabbed her slender ankles and spread her thighs wide enough to see what lay between them. He brought his cock right up to the hidden red flowers sitting open at her crotch. The tip of his hard erection pressed against the wet valley, his precum mixed with the sexual juices flooding her virgin slit. Tilde. She had already been brought to climax twice by SATORU's skilled caresses, so she did not have the strength left to even lift a finger and could only breath heavily while staring at him. SATORU too, before going for the first thrust, looked at Nanao. His eyes filled with tender love but also a question in it. He was clearly showing that even though it would be hard if she wanted to stop, he wouldn't force her. This, more than anything, made Nanao melt even more. I may be breaking the mood, but this is your last chance to back out. At this level, we can still stop and chalk it up to the fever of the festival. But if we continue, then that will be it. SATORU did not like being long-winded. Even more so when it came to matters of sex. But, Nanao was different from his previous relationship. She was someone important to him, and this changed everything. Nanao could see the worry and care in Gojo's eyes as he stared at her. She knew that right here, right now, if she asked to stop, he would. This was why. I want to do it. A short, simple sentence, showing him that this wasn't just a decision taken in the heat of the moment. Since it was so, it was time for her to end her century-old virginity. Chapter 90. Nanao, 2. I want to do it. The moment Nanao uttered those words, she felt as if her heart would explode because of embarrassment and anticipation. Even with her limited knowledge, she had imagined this very moment many times in her head, and she had to admit, this night was proving to be far better and sweeter than anything she could have imagined. SATORU felt his reasoning nearly snap. Letting out a big sigh at how destructive Nanao could be, he bent down and kissed her deeply, their bodies slowly entwining. Finally, while Nanao was completely focused on the kiss, he slowly pushed his gland in her tight vagina. Tilde. Nanao leaked out a small groan. The foreign intrusion in her body sent a weird tingle through her body. Meanwhile, SATORU could feel himself sink deeper into her. She was absurdly tight. The absence of hymen did not surprise him. Women could break their hymen just by doing a small amount of sports. Much less when breaking the sound barrier and fighting monsters that could destroy cities. Even so, with how tight she was, his intrusion was bound to hurt her a little. SATORU hesitated for a short while before deciding that piercing through it in one go would be better for her. Nanao, it might hurt a little. He raised his upper body and centered himself against her, gradually adding his weight onto her. He lowered himself onto her and locked lips. He sucked on her small soft lips, taunting her with his tongue. He squeezed and massaged her breasts with his hand. Once he soothed her a little, her tense muscles relaxed. When he could feel some room to move again, he pushed himself forward a bit more. A sharp pain shot through her body and Naneo gripped onto his shoulders with greater strength, to the point her fingertips paled. Wah tilde. Her hips shook the moment he gave a deep thrust. Ah tilde. At that moment, she lost the chastity she had protected for so long. Her thin eyebrows curved as the thick steak was driven into her, while pain surged through her crotch. She stifled a scream from the pain racing through her while Satoru hugged her tightly. At the same time, her nails scratched his back, but he did not mind as the pain she was feeling was without a doubt way worse. Unconsciously, she was tightening around his cock painfully. The vagina's wavy folds entangled his penis. It felt so good that he thought he might ejaculate even if he did not move. Looking at her moist eyes, Satoru slowly extended his tongue and licked the tears gathering at the corner of her eyes. Quote. Salty. Huff 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 I am all right, you can continue. Added Nobleman at. Satoru shook his head in refusal. He did not seek only his pleasure. He knew that she was rushing him because she wished to make him feel good. But this wouldn't be good for her. Deciding that she needed more time to adapt, he began to nibble her ear before trailing down kisses on her neck. While doing so, his right hand was rolling her nipple with his fingers, sometimes pinching them, though not too much. It didn't take long for her expression of pain to loosen up before melting once again in pleasure. It was clear that she was extremely sensitive. What's more, he knew that his life energy was also bringing her pleasure. He could already feel her vagina twitch and moisten. I am going to move. Why yeah. Satoru slowly began to move further up his waist, until it was swallowed up to the base just like that, the point bumped against the mouth of her womb. Her vagina shut hard and tightened around the whole penis. Even though her vagina's entrance was tight, it was thankfully rather deep and could accommodate his full length. He then began to go back and forth, while slowly accelerating. It did not take long for Naneo to begin moving her waist alongside him. She moaned out loud. She looked to be in pain, but her body twitched with pleasure. When he pulled out, she felt a burn from her inner walls, but once he pushed in again, her entrance swallowed him hungrily. Her soft inner walls continuously stimulated his shaft. He felt a surging sensation that was about to burst at the back of his neck. With each thrust, her womb twisted, her slender body jumped, and moans escaped her thin lips. He firmly held onto her hips as he bore deeper into her. As he continued to thrust, the viscous fluids created a constant moist slapping sound. Satoru was astonished at how amazing a woman she was. The tightness was to be expected with a virgin, but the way she moaned in joy and agony was indescribably sexy. He lifted her up so she was seated on his lap and thrust powerfully up into her from below. To avoid the pain of having her full weight gathered on their union, she desperately clung to his body. Ah tilde. Beads of sweat appeared on her flushed face and heated breaths escaped her lips thanks to the unknown feeling surging through her entire body. Her love juices dripped out with an obscenely wet sound while his massive member thrust in and out of her. Her mind gradually faded away and she had trouble thinking straight, almost like she had a serious fever. A vague white feeling surrounded her and she could focus only on the presence of the giant penis thrusting up into her crotch. Whenever he rubbed her vaginal wall, a pleasured panting voice leaked out from her mouth. Her panting voice was as clear as a bell, hearing it pleased him to no end. When he changed his angle, her body started trembling. He focused on the same place and rubbed his glands. Ah, there, it's amazing there, it's making me tremble, this is sex. Satoru smiled as he asked, indeed. Does it feel good? Quote. Yes. It's hot deep inside my stomach. Very well. I'm going to make you come as much as you like. He slowly changed the direction of his thrusts as he penetrated deeper. He concentrated on her panting and groaning, and stubbornly hammered into her most sensitive spot. Ah. Her insides squeezed and started to spasm. He saw that she was about to climax and plunge deeper into her. Ah. She screamed again and hugged him tightly. Her hot vagina began to contract, making Satoru lose the little amount of control he had left. The giant object inside her grew even larger and throbbed while she could feel something coursing through it. Growling deeply, he kissed her as he began to release his semen inside of her. I'm coming, he announced while a hot liquid erupted from the tip. Ah, it's going inside me. There's so much. Ah tilde. A hot liquid was spreading within her vagina. And while she experienced being cummed inside for the first time, she also achieved another climax. Ah! A shrill scream left her mouth and then she collapsed backward. The double stimulus was too strong for someone who was a virgin just a few moments ago. After coming all he wanted, he supported her limp body and slowly lay her down on the. His climax lasted so long. He felt like it was overflowing. Ah ah, ah. Once their mutual climax ended, the two were left breathless. Still sitting on his lap, Nanao looked dreamily at her first man. She could feel the hot liquid flowing in her body. Gathering strength in her limbs, she closed in, nibbled on his collarbone, and with an entranced expression flushed with lust, asked. Could we do it again? How could he refuse such a demand? Gently turning Nanao around before he pushed her on all four on the bed without pulling out. From behind. Yeah, you don't want it. I didn't say that. Quote. She was anxious because of how obscene this position looked like, but still supported her body with her arms and legs for a crawling pose. SATORU grabbed her adorable butt as he stared at her back which glistened brightly with sweat. Thankfully, the new position filled her with delight as it seemed to reach even deeper than she thought possible. As the bare-breasted witch stood on all fours like a dog, he reached below her arms and grabbed her breasts. He bounced them around for fun and stroked the hardened nipples while starting to move his hips again. Tilde. He parted the back of her long hair and kissed the white nape of her neck. He then licked along with her shoulder blades and spine. Your back is so pretty. Ah tilde. Nanao wiggled her back in embarrassment, though it was obvious how much she was enjoying his compliments. A large amount of love juices and semen were mixed by his rod. It would flow out whenever he thrust inside and it was mixed together whenever he pulled back. The sensation and the obscenely wet sound made the young maiden want to plug her ears, but at the same time, brought her even more pleasure. The sound of slapping flesh continuously rang in the room. His rod kept moving without rest as it spread the deepest depths of her vagina, pushed back her folds of flesh, and pressed against her womb. Nanao's face burned red, she dug her nails into the edge of the mat and cried out even louder than before. This position it's going to drive me crazy. Her entire body was twitching in response to his raging erection. Her shoulder blades were visible in her back as she arched it. SATORU, happy to discover that Nanao seemed to really love this position, continued without any worries. It feels good, doesn't it? Nanao closed her eyes and answered by simply nodding. Seeing the line of her slender back bending left and right increased his libido, making him rub against her lower body at an even greater pace. An avalanche of pleasure hit her and she could no longer support her upper body, so she started rubbing her face against the mat. However, she kept her thighs straight and indecently spread to allow the thick rod to enter even deeper. She started moving her butt in a circular motion to rub up against the manhood as it stickily reached her womb. She could not speak. She had never felt anything like this. Quote. As she let out a silent scream, SATORU thrust his rod inside her as hard as he could. The head fit firmly into the entrance of her womb and he exploded. He tightly squeezed the breasts in his hands and he lifted her body up. His hot semen sprayed inside her womb. Another orgasm washed over her like a great wave. That strong-willed woman ascended to a world of even greater pleasure. Her brain gave a great cry at the intense pleasure. Her vision whited out and then grew black. She passed out because of the pleasure.